Hello story enthusiasts. Welcome to Arcane Paradox. Today we venture into, what if Pomfrey's scan found 107 compulsion charms on Harry and Dumbledore's 65-year scheme collapsed. Your support means everything. Like and subscribe. Enjoy. Chapter 1. The scan. The bludger caught Harry in the ribs on the third pass, and he knew immediately from the specific, breathtaking quality of the pain that at least two were broken. He held on anyway. Gryffindor was down by 30 points and Cedric Diggory, brilliant, infuriating, genuinely decent Cedric Diggory, was already banking left toward what Harry was almost certain was a false trail. The snitch was nowhere near the west goalpost. Harry had seen it 20 seconds ago, a tiny flutter of gold near the Hufflepuff commentary box, and Cedric hadn't spotted it yet, which meant Harry had exactly one window before Cedric's seeker instincts caught up with his eyes. He didn't think about the ribs. He just flew. The wind ripped past his face and the crowd noise became one long undifferentiated roar, and Harry flattened himself against the firebolt's handle and pushed it past what the broom was probably rated for. The snitch saw him coming, they always seem to, somehow, and jinked left, and Harry's hand shot out, and his fingers closed around warm, vibrating gold. The whistle blew. Harry landed badly, because landing with broken ribs was just categorically a bad experience, and his legs folded underneath him in a way that got a collective wince from the Gryffindor stands. He was sitting in the mud trying to remember how breathing worked when Oliver would, no, wait, Oliver had graduated, this was Angelina, newly appointed captain, reached him first and immediately ruined any goodwill she'd built by shaking him by the shoulder. That was brilliant, Harry. Are you? She actually looked at him then. You're gray. Ribs, he managed. How many? Some of them. Madame Pomfrey arrived at something between a brisk walk and a controlled sprint, which was her version of panicking, and she had her wand out before she'd fully cleared the pitch boundary. The diagnostic spell she cast was standard. Harry had felt it dozens of times by this point in his Hogwarts career, a warm tingle that moved from crown to sole like a slow wave, and he was already preparing himself for the lecture about reckless flying and inadequate protective equipment that he absolutely had memorized by now. But Pomfrey didn't say anything about the ribs. She said nothing at all. Harry looked up at her face, because the silence had a quality to it that made something in the back of his neck prickle, and what he saw there stopped him cold. Madame Pomfrey had spent 30 years as Hogwarts matron. Harry had seen her expression cycle through irritation, exasperation, professional concern, and occasionally something approaching real fear during particularly bad injuries. He had never, in 4 years, seen her look like this. Her face had gone the color of old chalk. Her wand hand wasn't moving. She was staring at the diagnostic readout hovering above his chest, visible only to the caster, a shimmer of pale blue light that Harry couldn't read from his angle, with an expression that he could only describe as someone who had opened a door expecting a broom cupboard and found a body. Madame Pomfrey? Angelina said uncertainly. Everyone off the pitch, Pomfrey said. Her voice was completely level, and that somehow made it worse. We need to celebrate, the match just off the pitch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Now, Miss Johnson. That means you. That means everyone. Mr. Potter comes with me. Nobody argued. There was something in her face that precluded argument. She got Harry to his feet herself, one hand firm under his arm, and she was already casting a secondary charm before they'd crossed half the pitch, something Harry didn't recognize, a sharp silver diagnostic thread that she sent into him with an almost clinical precision that was very different from the warm sweep of the standard scan. What is it? Harry asked, because he had always found it better to ask directly. People usually told him things when he asked directly, at least more often than when he waited for them to volunteer it. Is it the ribs? Is there something wrong with the ribs? The ribs are the least interesting thing I've found in the last 45 seconds, Mr. Potter, she said, and that should concern you quite a bit. It did. She walked him through the castle's side entrance, bypassing the main corridors entirely. It was a route Harry had never actually used, probably a staff access passage, and the hospital wing was empty when they arrived, which was unusual for a match day. She settled him onto the nearest bed and immediately cast a ward on the door. A proper one. Harry heard the lock engage and watched a faint shimmer spread across the wood, and that was when his stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with ribs. Pomfrey cast the full diagnostic sequence again, this time taking her time, methodical and precise. She didn't say anything while she worked. Harry watched the pale light above his chest shift through several colors, white, then blue, then a deep unsettled amber that darkened towards something almost red at certain moments, and he watched her face, and her face told him nothing except that what she was reading was making her angrier and more frightened in equal measure with every passing second. When she finally lowered her wand, Harry said, "Tell me." She pulled a chair to his bedside, which she never did. Madame Pomfrey was a woman who stood. She sat down, set her wand on her knee, and looked at him for a long moment in a way that made him feel simultaneously like a patient and like someone she was trying to figure out how to protect. "How familiar are you," she said carefully, "with compulsion charms?" Harry blinked. "In theory. They're in magical theory of mind, 3rd year. Subtle enchantments. They can modify behavior, suppress impulses, reinforce specific tendencies, yes." She nodded. "That's the academic definition. What you may not know, because it is not taught at the student level, is that they leave traces in the magical core. Every compulsion charm ever cast on a person leaves a residue, think of it like scar tissue, magically speaking. A standard diagnostic scan doesn't look for it because standard diagnostics are looking for injury and illness. But the ministry mandated an expanded diagnostic protocol for all Hogwarts medical staff 18 months ago after the Ravenclaw incident in '93, and that expanded protocol includes a behavioral modification screen." She paused. "I cast it on all injured students now, as a matter of course. I cast it on you tonight." "Okay," Harry said slowly. "Harry." She very rarely used his first name. It landed differently when she did. The standard finding for a person who has never been subjected to any behavioral modification magic is a reading of 0. Findings above 0 are considered highly irregular. The highest I have personally recorded in 30 years of practice was a 6, a child from a deeply troubled home, clearly subjected to repeat illegal enchantments over several years. I filed a full report with the DMLE and it resulted in a criminal prosecution. Harry was very still. "What did mine read?" he asked, though some part of him already understood that the number was going to be something that broke whatever understanding he had of his own life. Madame Pomfrey's jaw tightened. 107, she said. Active compulsion and behavioral modification markers. 107, Mr. Potter. Layered across your magical core, your limbic response pathways, and what I can only describe as your fundamental instinctual architecture. She stood abruptly, because sitting still had apparently become impossible for her, and turned away from him for a moment before turning back. Some of them are old. Very old. The deepest layers date, as best I can estimate from the resonance signatures, to before you could walk. The hospital wing was very quiet. Outside, Harry could hear the distant sounds of the celebration drifting from the Quidditch pitch. Someone had conjured music. There was laughter. Before I could walk, he repeated. The oldest markers carry a magical signature I recognize, she said, and her voice had gone tight in a way that told him she very much did not want to say the next part. I have seen that signature before, Mr. Potter. Every member of staff has, in passing. It is well documented in the academic literature. It is, she stopped. Pressed her lips together. Made some internal decision. It is Albus Dumbledore's signature. Harry didn't say anything. He thought about the way he'd always trusted Dumbledore instinctively, even when that trust seemed to have no logical basis. The way certain thoughts, about leaving Hogwarts, about demanding answers, about questioning the headmaster's decisions, always seemed to slip away from him before they fully formed, like trying to hold smoke. The way he'd spent 4 years accepting things that, laid out plainly, made no sense. The Dursleys. The lack of contact with Sirius. The way he'd walked into danger after danger and never once seriously considered simply refusing. He thought about the Sorting Hat, which had wanted to put him in Slytherin. Harry had always secretly suspected the Hat had seen something in him that he couldn't see in himself. 107 charms. What do they do? His voice was steady. He was vaguely surprised by that. Pomfrey sat back down. She had her clinical face on now, the professional armor that let her deliver terrible news without flinching, but her eyes were still doing something complicated. Categorically, what I can identify from the readout falls into several types. There are suppression charms, these reduce capacity in specific areas. Magical output limitation, your spell work is being actively throttled, Harry, likely has been since early childhood. Cognitive acceleration suppression, a charm designed to keep your strategic and analytical thinking slightly slower than your natural baseline. Instinctual caution reduction, this one is particularly insidious, it makes you more likely to rush into dangerous situations rather than assess them. There are loyalty-binding charms, which create an emotional predisposition toward specific individuals and against others. She paused. There is a very sophisticated grief amplification charm layered over what appears to be a guilt induction matrix. When I say grief amplification, I mean that your experience of loss, your parents, your circumstances, has been deliberately kept more immediate and overwhelming than it would naturally be. Harry stared at the ceiling. The guilt matrix, she continued, and her voice had gone almost flat with the effort of professional control, appears designed to make you feel personally responsible for harm that comes to others. To make you feel that your existence is a burden and a danger. To make you more likely to accept self-sacrifice as the obvious solution to any given problem. Silence. He wanted a martyr, Harry said. It wasn't a question, and Pomfrey didn't treat it like one. She simply said, I don't know his full intentions. What I know is what the magic tells me, and what the magic tells me is that someone has spent an extraordinary amount of effort shaping who you are. Shaping what you feel capable of. Shaping what questions you ask and which ones slide away before you can finish thinking them. She reached out and briefly, unprofessionally, put her hand over his. You should know, and I want to be very clear about this, that none of this is your fault, and none of it reflects on who you actually are. Who am I actually? Harry asked, and he hadn't meant it to come out like that, like a genuine question, raw at the edges, but it did. Pomfrey's expression shifted into something fierce. That's what we're going to find out. But first. She stood, moved to her office, and came back with a roll of parchment and a self-inking quill. I'm going to do something I should do regardless of everything else. I'm going to fix your ribs. And then I am going to write the most important letter of my professional career. She paused with the quill hovering. Harry, are you familiar with Amelia Bones? Head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Susan's aunt. Yes. She's also the person responsible for investigating illegal magical modification of minors, and she is, in my considerable experience, one of the perhaps 3 people in the British magical world who cannot be pressured, bought, or managed by Albus Dumbledore. She met his eyes. I need to send her a sealed emergency communication. Before I do that, I need your permission. This is your body. This is your life. I will not act on your behalf without you telling me to. Harry looked at this woman, sturdy, silver-haired, fierce-eyed, doing the most competent thing he'd ever seen an adult do on his behalf, which was simply asking him what he wanted, and felt something shift inside his chest that had nothing to do with broken ribs. Send it, he said. She sent it. While the letter was in the air, carried by a school owl she'd selected from the Ollery through some kind of remote calling charm Harry hadn't known existed, Pomfrey healed his ribs with efficient, practiced spell work, her wand moving in quick precise arcs. Harry barely felt the bones reset. His mind was doing something it had apparently been prevented from doing properly for a very long time, thinking clearly and quickly and without an inexplicable fog at the edges of every thought. 107. He'd always thought his tendency to charge headfirst at danger was just personality. Gryffindor instinct. His father's blood. He'd always thought the guilt about Cedric, about his parents, about anyone who got hurt near him, was just normal human feeling. He'd always thought the way complicated thoughts about his own situation seemed to dissolve before he could properly form them was just the distraction of a chaotic life. He thought about the Triwizard Tournament, which he hadn't entered and hadn't wanted to participate in and had been told he had to anyway. He thought about how quickly he'd resigned himself to that. How the idea of simply walking out of the Great Hall and refusing had never, not once, crossed his mind. The power throttle, he said. If it was removed. What would that? I don't know, Pomfrey said honestly. There's no way to predict what your full magical capacity looks like from the outside. The fact that you've accomplished what you have under this level of suppression is, she paused, searching for the word. Extraordinary doesn't cover it, Harry. Can they be removed? All of them? Yes. It will require a specialist, a charm reversal team, ideally from St. Mungo's, specifically their magical modification ward. The process is not painful but it is disorienting. You will likely emerge from it feeling very different. She watched him carefully. Possibly feeling angry. I'm already angry, Harry said mildly. She almost smiled. I know. I meant more systematically angry. The grief amplifier and guilt matrix alone, when those lift, you will realize how artificially heavy you've been carrying things. It may feel quite significant. The door of the hospital wing rattled. Not a knock, a rattling, the way a door moved when someone outside realized it was warded and was trying to determine the ward's nature. Pomfrey's eyes went to it immediately. Who has access to override your ward? Harry asked. The headmaster, she said. Though he would need a reason to assert it. She stood. I suspect the match is over and people have begun asking where you are. She was right. The second rattle was followed by a knock, and then Ron's voice, Harry. Pomfrey? Is he in there? Then, muffled consultation, and then a slightly different knock, sharper, more deliberate, and a different voice entirely. Poppy. Dumbledore. Warm, unhurried, utterly calm. I wonder if I might look in on Mr. Potter. The match concluded some time ago and there's some concern. Harry watched Pomfrey's face. He watched her spine straighten, watched her chin come up, watched something resolve behind her eyes in real time as she made the kind of decision that people carried with them for the rest of their lives. She walked to the door. She did not open it. She spoke through it with perfectly measured professional courtesy. Mr. Potter sustained rib fractures during the match and is currently under observation. I'm afraid the wing is in diagnostic restriction for the next several hours, Headmaster. No visitors while I have active scans running. A brief pause. Of course, Poppy. Might I ask which diagnostic protocols? Simply for my own records, I like to, standard expanded protocol as per ministry mandate, Headmaster. I'll file a full report in the morning. Good night. Another pause. This one had a different texture. Good night, Poppy, Dumbledore said pleasantly, and his footsteps moved away down the corridor. Pomfrey stood with her hand on the warded door for 3 full seconds before she turned back around. When she faced Harry, her expression had moved past fear and past fury and arrived somewhere cleaner and colder. He'll go to his office, Harry said. He'll think about what expanded protocol covers. He'll realize, he'll know within the hour, she agreed. Which is why I want you to understand the timeline, Harry. I've sent for Amelia Bones. She is a woman who moves quickly when the situation demands it. But there is likely a window between now and her arrival during which the headmaster will attempt to manage the situation. She said the words like they tasted of something rotten. He will not be able to alter a filed medical diagnostic record. I encoded this one with a ministry standard witness seal the moment the results appeared on my screen. He cannot change what I found. But he may try to speak to you. To reframe it. I know what he does, Harry said quietly. I've watched him do it for 4 years. I just didn't know why it worked so well. Pomfrey looked at him for a long moment. You're taking this very calmly. I'm not calm, Harry said. I'm just thinking. It turns out I'm quite good at thinking when I can actually finish a thought. He looked down at his hands. Pomfrey. The loyalty-binding charms. The ones that create emotional predisposition toward specific people. He looked up. Who's bound in? She hesitated. Tell me. The binding runs both directions, she said quietly. Toward specific individuals and away from others. I can identify the general architecture, predisposition toward Dumbledore, toward the Weasley family connection, toward Hermione Granger's influence specifically in terms of deference to authority structures. And away from, Slytherin students categorically, more specifically against Draco Malfoy, against any Malfoy, and notably, quite strongly, against Severus Snape. Against Snape. Harry considered that. So my hatred of Snape might be, amplified, at minimum. Possibly wholly manufactured. She paused. I want to be careful. The charm amplifies predispositions. It doesn't invent them wholesale. There may be genuine reasons you find him difficult. But the intensity of the aversion? That's not natural. Harry thought about 4 years of simmering loathing. The way just seeing Snape in the corridor made his shoulders go up and his jaw tighten. How automatic it was. How it had never occurred to him to question it. What about the Weasleys, he asked, and the question cost him more than he'd expected, because Ron was his best friend, and he needed to know if that was real. Predisposition toward the family connection, she said carefully. Harry, that's not the same as manufacturing the friendship. It may simply mean you were nudged toward them when you might otherwise have sought connection elsewhere too. Your affection for them reads, in so far as I can read anything of this kind, as genuine. Just possibly tunneled. He filed that away. Not resolved, but filed. What about Hermione? She is fascinating, in a purely diagnostic sense, Pomfrey said, with a very slight and complicated expression. The charm doesn't bind you to her emotionally, she has apparently accomplished that entirely on her own. What it does is channel your response to her intellectual authority specifically toward rule following and institutional trust. She tells you something is against the rules, and the charm makes that land with more weight than it should. Her approval or disapproval of your behavior has been given disproportionate influence. Harry thought about every time he'd backed down from something because Hermione had called it dangerous or against the rules. There were a lot of those times. She doesn't know, he said. Almost certainly not. She paused. Most of the people in your life almost certainly don't know. People rarely do, when they're being used as instruments. That was a sentence that would need time to sit. Before it could, the hospital wing's external diagnostic mirror, a small oval thing mounted near the door that Pomfrey used to check on the Olary communication status, flashed once, silver, then twice in quick succession. Pomfrey turned to it immediately. Something moved through her expression that might, almost, have been relief. She's coming, she said. Amelia Bones. She'll be here within the hour. She's already pulled the Ministry emergency transit. She turned back to Harry, and this time there was something fiercely warm in her face. She's not coming alone. She's bringing a charm reversal specialist. Harry swung his legs off the bed. His ribs were healed but his whole body felt strange, not painful, exactly, but aware of itself in a way that was new, like stepping out of a room you'd lived in for years and noticing for the first time that the ceiling was too low. She moves fast, he said. She's had the report for 17 minutes, Pomfrey said, and she responded within 4. Amelia Bones has been waiting for something like this for a long time. She began clearing the diagnostic equipment, organizing her workspace with quick sure movements. She has a word for what she suspects has been happening at this school for the past decade. For the way certain cases get closed before they're opened. For the way certain names never appear in DMLE reports even when they should. What's the word? Harry asked. Pomfrey set her wand down precisely on the desk. Later, she said. For now, are you hungry? I find that conversations of this magnitude go better when someone has eaten. Harry almost laughed. There was something so fundamentally Pomfrey about the question, a woman who had just uncovered what might be the greatest crime in the modern British magical world, making sure he'd had his tea. Actually, he said, yeah. I'm starving. She summoned a house elf with a quiet word, and a tray appeared, sandwiches, tea, a slice of something Harry thought might be treacle tart, and Harry sat in the hospital wing in the growing dark outside the windows and ate, and thought, and felt, with increasing clarity, the strange sensation of a mind beginning to run at something close to its actual speed. He thought about his parents. James and Lily Potter, 21 years old when they died, who had trusted Dumbledore enough to go into hiding based on his counsel, who had trusted him with their secret, who had died because that secret had been compromised. Harry had spent 4 years thinking about them with a particular kind of grief, bright and overwhelming, always right at the surface, the loss never quite scabbing over. It had felt like love. He thought now, with a cold precision that surprised him, that it might have been partly manufactured. That someone had deliberately kept the wound fresh and open because a grieving boy was a controllable boy. The thought should have made him sadder. Instead it made him angry, which felt, oddly, more honest. He thought about the Triwizard Tournament. About how his name had come out of the Goblet of Fire and the entire school, including the adults, had essentially divided into two camps, those who believed him and those who didn't. Dumbledore had looked at him over the goblet that evening with an expression Harry had read as concern, as care. He turned that memory over now and looked at the other side of it, a man who had seen something go wrong with a plan he was running, and had been calculating how to absorb it. He thought about the prophecy. He'd heard a fragment of it, Trelawney's version, which didn't amount to much in isolation. But Dumbledore clearly knew more. Dumbledore clearly knew quite a lot. And the thing that Harry was only now properly equipped to notice was, Dumbledore had never told him. Had never treated him as a person who deserved to understand his own situation. A weapon didn't need to understand. A weapon just needed to point in the right direction. He set down the teacup. Outside the windows of the hospital wing, the sky had gone full dark, the stars of a clear October night scattered above the black lake. Harry watched them and let his mind run without interference, possibly for the first time ever, and what his mind produced was not despair or confusion but something altogether colder and more useful. A plan. Or the beginning of one. He was still turning it over when he heard the sound, not from the door, but from Pomfrey's private flute connection in her office, the small hearth she used for direct communication with St. Mungo's. The green flare came under the office door and Pomfrey was on her feet immediately. A moment later she came back into the main wing, and behind her came a woman who Harry recognized immediately from ministry documents he'd seen during the summer, square-jawed, broad-shouldered, wearing the monocle he'd heard about but never seen, and carrying herself with the particular kind of authority that didn't need announcing because it just was. Amelia Bones looked at Harry the way a competent person looks at a situation, quickly, completely, and without flinching at what she found. Behind her came a younger woman in St. Mungo's healer robes, charm reversal specialist, Harry assumed, carrying a case he recognized from medical textbooks as a corework kit. And behind them, making Harry's heart do something complicated in his chest, came Sirius Black, wearing civilian clothes Harry had never seen him in and looking like a man who had been told something on the journey over and was only barely holding the consequent emotions inside his body through sheer effort of will. Sirius looked at Harry. His face did several things in rapid succession. He crossed the room in 4 strides and pulled Harry into a hug that was far more fierce than graceful, and Harry, who had spent 4 years telling himself he was fine, let it be fierce. "I'm going to kill him," Sirius said, very quietly, into the top of Harry's head. "Get in line," Harry said, equally quietly. They separated. Sirius held him by the shoulders for a moment, looked at his face with something that was grief and fury and love all at once, and then let go and stepped back and became, Harry watched it happen, something more than the slightly chaotic emotional figure Harry was used to. Sirius became still. Sharp. "Okay," Sirius said, and his voice had a quality Harry hadn't heard in it before. "Okay. What's the plan?" Amelia Bones had positioned herself near Pomfrey's diagnostic desk and was already reading the sealed report, her monocle refracting a thin beam of light across the parchment. She hadn't spoken yet. When she did, it was without looking up. 107, she said. "Yes," said Pomfrey. "And the oldest signature cross-references to, yes," said Pomfrey again. Bones finished reading. She set the parchment down. She looked at Harry with the expression of someone who has spent many years building a case in her mind and has just received the first piece of irrefutable physical evidence. "Mr. Potter," she said. "I'm going to ask you one question and I need an honest answer. Not what you think I want to hear. Not what you've been told to say. Your honest answer." "All right," Harry said. "Do you consent to the removal of all behavioral modification charms currently identified in your magical core, with full understanding that the process may reveal significant differences between your suppressed self and your natural state?" Harry didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. The charm reversal specialist, she introduced herself as Healer Marchbanks, a grandniece of Griselda, which Harry would have found amusing in a different moment, asked him to lie back on the bed, and she spoke quietly to Pomfrey while she arranged the tools from her case. Harry watched the ceiling and listened to Sirius settle into a chair nearby, and he felt Amelia Bones move to the door and speak in a low, quick voice to someone outside, a junior Auror, Harry realized, who had come through the flow behind them and was now apparently standing guard in the corridor. The castle was quiet. It was late enough now that most students would be in their common rooms. The feast sounds had faded. Dumbledore's study was 3 floors up and across the north wing. Harry thought about the headmaster up there right now, turning over the conversation with Pomfrey, parsing the words expanded protocol and diagnostic restriction, running the equations of what might have been found and what could be done about it. He thought, "You've had 65 years. Tonight is mine." Healer Marchbanks rested her wand gently over his forehead. "This will feel like pressure," she said quietly. "Not pain. Like the tide going out. Don't fight it, just let it move." Harry nodded. "Ready?" "Yes." And the healer began to work, and the tide began to go out, and in the growing silence of his own mind, Harry Potter, uncharmed, unthrottled, unmanaged, began, for the first time in his living memory, to arrive. Chapter 2, The Tide Goes Out. The pressure started at the crown of his head. Not painful, Healer Marchbanks had been right about that, but enormous, the way a sound could be enormous without being loud. Like the moment before a thunderclap, when the air itself seemed to hold its breath and compress. Harry lay on the hospital bed staring at the ceiling and felt it move through him in slow deliberate waves, each one pulling something loose. The first charm to lift was one he hadn't known was there. He felt it go like a knot unraveling between his shoulder blades, a tension he'd carried so long it had become invisible, the way people stopped noticing a scar after enough years. When it released, he took a breath that was physically different from any breath he'd taken before. Deeper. Like his lungs had just discovered they were twice the size they'd thought. "That's one," Marchbanks said softly. Sirius was gripping the arm of the chair so hard his knuckles had gone white. Amelia Bones stood with her back against the wall near the door, and she was watching the diagnostic readout above Harry's chest with an expression that had locked down into something unreadable. Pomfrey was at her desk making notes. Harry could hear the scratch of the quill, her method of managing whatever she was feeling being to document everything so thoroughly that it couldn't escape. The second charm lifted like a film being peeled from his eyes. This one he noticed immediately because his vision didn't change, the ceiling looked the same, the light was the same, but his understanding of what he was looking at sharpened in a way that made him suddenly aware that he'd been operating behind glass his whole life. Thoughts that he hadn't finished, half-formed questions about his situation, about the Dursleys, about why Dumbledore kept him so deliberately uninformed, sprang suddenly into full clarity like photographs developing in fast-forward. He didn't speak. He filed them. Cognitive suppression marker, second tier, Marchbanks murmured. That one was deep. How are you doing? Sirius asked, and his voice had a controlled steadiness that Harry recognized as deliberate effort. Fine, Harry said. Then, no, that's a habit. It's strange. It feels like waking up, but not it doesn't feel bad. It felt like more. More of everything. More clarity, more capacity, more of whatever it was that made him him. The edges of the world were crisper. The connections between things came faster and more naturally. He'd always been told he had good instincts. What he was discovering was that his instincts had always been excellent but had been running at a fraction of their proper speed. The third and fourth charms lifted in quick succession, and those were the ones Marchbanks had warned him about. The grief amplifier went first. He'd expected it to hurt. He'd expected the removal of something that had shaped every experience of loss he'd ever had to feel like tearing. Instead it felt like setting down a weight he'd been carrying up a long flight of stairs, a sudden, acute awareness of how heavy it had been, followed by something that was almost frighteningly close to lightness. His parents were still dead. The knowledge of that sat in his chest unchanged, a bedrock fact. But the raw, always present bleeding quality of it, the way it had colored everything, the way guilt and grief had twisted together into something that made self-sacrifice feel obvious, that was gone. He understood now, in the clean air of its absence, what it had actually been. Not love for his parents. His love for them was still there, real and undamaged. The amplifier had been something separate, a hook, deliberately barbed. The guilt matrix lifted next. Harry lay very still for a long moment after that one. Because when it lifted, when that particular lens was removed from the way he saw every choice, every consequence, every person who'd ever been hurt near him, what replaced it was an absence. It was clarity. He looked back at 4 years of choices through eyes that were no longer weighted with artificially amplified responsibility, and what he saw was a boy who had been so thoroughly convinced that other people's suffering was his fault that he had been reliably, predictably willing to pay any price to stop it. A perfect weapon. Walk into danger. Of course, he'd hurt everyone around him by existing, so his own life was already forfeit. Sacrifice himself? Obviously, that was just being responsible. Trust the headmaster. Why wouldn't he? At least the headmaster seemed to have a plan, and the guilt of being the problem was easier to bear when someone else claimed to have the solution. Harry. Sirius's voice was careful. Talk to me. I'm thinking, Harry said. His own voice sounded different to his ears. More settled. Lower, almost, as if it had stopped making itself smaller to fit the space it had been assigned. About how elegant it was, Harry said. The whole construction. Grief amplifier keeps me emotionally destabilized. Guilt matrix makes me feel responsible for everyone's problems. Instinct suppressor keeps me from thinking strategically about my own situation. Power throttle means I'm never quite confident enough in myself to trust my own judgment over his. He paused. Loyalty binding makes sure I stay surrounded by people who reinforce the structure. Cognitive suppressor keeps the full picture slightly out of reach. He was quiet for a moment. It's actually brilliant. I don't want it to be brilliant, but it is. It's not brilliant, Sirius said flatly. It's monstrous. They're not mutually exclusive. Sirius had no answer for that. Marchbanks worked steadily for another 40 minutes. Some of the remaining charms were simple, single-layer suppressors that lifted cleanly and left no particular sensation. Others were complex, multi-threaded constructions that she had to disassemble carefully, narrating quietly to Pomfrey as she worked. The loyalty bindings were intricate. Harry felt each one release as a kind of recalibration, not the destruction of feeling but the removal of artificial weight. His affection for Ron didn't vanish, it settled into something that felt more genuinely his, less reflexive and more chosen. His response to Hermione's authority shifted from automatic deference to something more considered. The aversion charms around Snape were last. Marchbanks hesitated over those. "These are old," she said. "And they're compound. There are 6 layered here. Original placement seems to have been around age 8. Reinforced several times since." "Remove them," Harry said. "It may feel disorienting. Your response to this individual, remove them." She removed them. What Harry felt when they lifted was not warmth toward Snape. He didn't suddenly feel a rush of affection for the man who'd spent 4 years targeting him and his friends. What he felt was more useful than that, a sudden, complete absence of the irrational component. The automatic, bone-deep flinching quality of the dislike dissolved, leaving behind something much cooler and more honest. He thought about Snape with a mind that was no longer being pushed and found, a complicated man, clearly damaged, clearly brilliant, who had treated Harry with patterned cruelty that had genuine roots and genuine consequences. Harry didn't like him. But the quality of not liking him was different now, considered rather than conditioned. He thought, Snape might be worth talking to. And then, on the heels of that, Snape is carrying Dumbledore's loyalty mark. Pomfrey said so. He filed it. 107, Marchbanks announced. All active markers cleared. Residue will fade within 72 hours. The magical core should begin expressing at natural capacity within. She paused, because whatever the diagnostic readout was showing had given her pause. Pomfrey came to look over her shoulder. There was a silence. "Well," said Pomfrey. And then, for perhaps the first time in Harry's memory, she said absolutely nothing else for almost 10 seconds. "What?" Sirius demanded. "His natural core rating," Marchbanks said carefully, it will need to be measured properly by St. Mungo's with full equipment. The portable kit isn't calibrated for," she seemed to be choosing words with precision. "It's significant. That's the word I'll use. His natural baseline, with no suppressors, is significant." "How significant?" Amelia Bones asked from across the room. Marchbanks looked up. "The last person who read at this tier was," she stopped. "Was who?" Sirius said. "The records I'm aware of at this level are limited," Marchbanks said. "Dumbledore. Possibly Voldemort at his peak. The historical record shows 1 or 2 others per century." She looked at Harry with an expression that had shifted from professional to something more personal. "Mr. Potter, with your suppressors active, you've already performed magic that senior Aurors would struggle to replicate." "Without them, I know," Harry said quietly. He did know. Or rather, he was beginning to. Because he could feel it, not like a flood, not dramatic, but undeniable, the way you feel a river that's always been held behind a dam when someone opens the gates. Not an explosion. A current. Deep and constant and very, very large. He sat up. He sat up and swung his legs off the bed and stood in one movement, and the room felt different when he was standing in it. Not physically, the ceiling was the same height, the beds were the same beds, but the space seemed to have a different relationship to him. Or he to it. Sirius was looking at him with an expression that Harry couldn't quite categorize. Pride was there, definitely. Fear was there too, not of Harry but for him, and something else underneath both, recognition, maybe, of something Sirius had suspected for a long time. "You look different," Sirius said. "I feel different." Harry looked at his hands. Standard Potter hands, slightly scarred, ink-stained on the right index finger from note-taking. The same hands. Different hands. "I feel like myself. I think that might be the first time I can honestly say that." Amelia Bones pushed off the wall. She had been patient long enough. "Right," she said. "Here's where we are." She moved to the center of the room with the ease of someone who habitually commanded the attention of rooms. The diagnostic report is sealed, ministry witnessed, and already transmitted to a secure DMLE archive. It cannot be altered, it cannot be suppressed, and it is time-stamped to 43 minutes ago. Albus Dumbledore cannot make it disappear. Harry looked at her steadily. He'll try something else. Yes, she agreed, without softening it. He will. He will argue medical misinterpretation. He will argue that some of the markers predate him, which some of them may. There's a question of the protections placed on you at birth and whether any of those have been subsequently modified. He will likely argue intent, that whatever modifications were made were done for your protection. He will be articulate, reasonable, and completely full of rubbish, and he will have people who believe him because he has spent 65 years ensuring that people believe him. What can you actually do to him? Sirius asked. Legally. Right now. Right now, tonight. I can begin a formal investigation under the Magical Persons Protection Act of 1947, which covers unauthorized magical modification of minors. I can seal his access to certain ministry communications. I can, and I intend to, summon him to a formal interview under Veritaserum protocols within the week. She paused. What I cannot do tonight is arrest him. He holds the position of Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot. Arresting him requires a majority vote of the body he chairs. That's convenient, Harry said drily. Bones's mouth twitched very slightly in what might have been a smile in a different context. It is not a coincidence, I suspect. However, she looked at him directly. There are legal mechanisms available to you that you may not be aware of, Mr. Potter, because they are the kind of thing that someone in your situation was never meant to know about. What mechanisms? The most ancient and noble house of Potter has 2 seats on the Wizengamot. Your father was Lord Potter. You are his heir. As of your 14th birthday, you were legally entitled to claim those seats and the associated proxy votes, under a mature minor exception that has existed in wizarding law since 1823. She held his gaze. No one told you. Harry thought about that. 2 Wizengamot seats, sitting empty for 4 years, that he'd been legally entitled to claim. Seats that would have given him political standing. Influence. The ability to participate in the governance of a world that had spent his whole life governing him. And the Black family? Sirius said, and his voice had an edge in it. You are the lord of the most ancient and noble house of Black, Bones said to Sirius. You have been legally free for 7 months, since the formal review of your case. You have not claimed your seat either. She let that land. The Black family holds 3 Wizengamot seats. Sirius sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that kept producing the same terrible answer. 5 seats, Harry said. 5 seats, Bones confirmed. Against Dumbledore's current block, which I estimate at around 23 reliable votes. But there are 14 uncommitted members of the Wizengamot who have grown increasingly uncomfortable with the Chief Warlock's consolidation of influence over the past decade and are waiting for a credible alternative. 5 seats, arriving together with a formal criminal investigation as the reason for their emergence. She left the sentence deliberately unfinished. It changes the math, Harry said. Considerably. Sirius had lowered his gaze from the ceiling and was looking at Harry with something that had moved past recognition into something simpler and stronger. Harry recognized it as the look of someone who was deciding, in real time, to trust another person's lead. Coming from Sirius, who had spent 12 years in Azkaban accumulating every reason in the world not to trust anything, it was not a small thing. When can we claim the seats? Harry asked Bones. I can have the paperwork filed by morning and the formal registration confirmed within 48 hours. She paused. Are you certain you want to do this publicly and this quickly? Once you make that move, he'll know I'm not going to be managed, Harry said. Yes. I know. That's the point. Bones studied him for a moment. You sound considerably different than you did when you walked into this hospital wing. I am considerably different than I was when I walked into this hospital wing, Harry said. The flue in Pomfrey's office flared green again. Everyone's attention snapped to it. Pomfrey was already moving, but before she reached her office door, the visitor announced themselves, not a person, just a folded piece of parchment that shot through the fireplace at speed and stopped, hovering, in the air near Harry's shoulder. His name was on it in handwriting he knew. He took it. The parchment unfolded itself. I know you're awake and that Poppy has kept you isolated tonight. I suspect something significant has occurred. I would very much like to speak with you, Harry, privately and without other parties present, at your earliest convenience. I want you to know that whatever you've been told, whatever you've discovered, I have always acted with your well-being and the well-being of our world as my primary concern. Yours, Albus. The room was very quiet while Harry read it. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and set it on the bedside table and looked at Sirius and Amelia Bones and Madame Pomfrey and Healer Marchbanks in turn. He's scared, Harry said. Yes, said Bones. Not scared enough to admit anything. Just scared enough to try to get to me before you do. Also yes. Harry picked up the parchment again, borrowed Pomfrey's quill, and wrote 4 words on the back. Not tonight. Not privately. He sent it back through the school's internal message system and set the quill down. Sirius made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He's not going to like that. Good, Harry said simply. He crossed to the window and looked out at the grounds. The Black Lake was a flat dark mirror under the stars, and the Forbidden Forest was a wall of shadow beyond the edge of the lawn. He'd spent 4 years looking at this view from this window after various Quidditch injuries and various adventures and various brushes with things that should have killed him, and he'd always found it vaguely comforting. He found it different tonight. Not less comforting, more clarifying. The grounds were the same grounds. He was not the same person who had looked at them before. Marchbanks, he said without turning. The suppressors that were on my magical output. What's the expected timeline before my actual capacity is fully accessible? Hours, not days, she said. The core rebounds quickly once the suppressors are cleared. You may find your spellwork responds differently as early as tomorrow morning. Different how? More. In every direction. I'd suggest avoiding combat magic for the first week while you calibrate. Right, Harry said. He thought about the Triwizard Tournament. He was still technically a competitor, his name still bound to a magically binding contract. The third task was months away, but the second was, he did the calculation, coming up. He thought about the tasks with his unthrottled mind and found, slightly grimly, that they looked very different. He'd spent weeks being anxious about his preparation. He was now having difficulty identifying anything in the tasks that he should actually be worried about. He turned back to the room. Sirius, he said. Tomorrow, when Dumbledore requests a meeting, and he will, probably through McGonagall, I need you present. Not as emotional support. As Lord Black. Sirius straightened. Absolutely. Bones. The investigation filing. Is there any reason it can't go in tonight rather than morning? She was already reaching for her briefcase. None whatsoever. Pomfrey. He met the matron's eyes. Is there any way I can see the full diagnostic record? The complete breakdown. She handed him a copy she'd apparently already made and sealed with his name. He took it and looked down at the first page. A long column of entries, each charm listed with its estimated placement date, its type, and the corresponding signature. The oldest entry at the top was dated to when he was approximately 14 months old. He looked at the signature. He'd seen Dumbledore's handwriting on enough notices, proclamations, and school communications over 4 years to know it when he saw it. He closed the folder. I have a question, he said to the room at large. And I want honest answers, not careful ones. He looked at Amelia Bones. Snape. He's also carrying Dumbledore's loyalty markers. Pomfrey found that in the initial scan. How many? Pomfrey looked up from her desk. Yes. When I ran the expanded protocol on your results, the signature matching function cross-referenced other individuals in the school as a secondary comparison. Severus Snape shows 11 markers. Several of them are behavioral loyalty constructs. Harry nodded slowly. He thinks he chose Dumbledore's side. He thinks his loyalty is his own decision. Probably, Pomfrey said. Is it possible to tell him? Harry said. Officially. So he knows. A silence. You want to tell Snape that he's been magically manipulated into his loyalty to Dumbledore? Sirius said carefully. I want Snape to know the truth, Harry said. Whatever he does with it is his business. But he deserves to know. He paused. Also he's brilliant and he hates Dumbledore on whatever level isn't being suppressed, which means he might be useful. And I'd rather have him informed and making his own choices than ignorant and useful to someone who's been managing him as thoroughly as he's been managing me. There was a moment where everyone in the room appeared to be processing the fact that Harry had just proposed strategically liberating Severus Snape from magical manipulation as a tactically sound move, and that he had done so with a completeness of reasoning that brooked no obvious counter-argument. I'll add him to the investigation's preliminary interview list, Bones said, and she said it in the tone of someone making a small note about something very large. It was past midnight by the time the formal pieces were in motion. Marchbanks had completed her work and departed through the flue, leaving a care plan and a standing order for follow-up at St. Mungo's. Bones had filed the preliminary investigation notice from Pomfrey's office, Harry had heard her rapid, clipped dictation through the closed door, and had settled into the matron's wing with a small stack of evidence to review. Her junior auror, a quiet young woman named Proudfoot, had taken up a discreet position outside the hospital wing door. The school was fully silent now. Deep middle-of-the-night silence, the kind that made every sound distinct and slightly magnified. Sirius had pulled his chair closer to Harry's bed and was sitting in it without the frantic energy Harry was used to from him, which was interesting in itself. The events of the evening seemed to have burned something out of Sirius, not his warmth, but the restless, trapped quality he'd carried since Azkaban. He seemed like he'd found somewhere to put his anger, which made him calmer and more frightening simultaneously. Tell me about my dad, Harry said. It came out directly, without preamble, which was also new. He'd always circled around asking Sirius about James and Lily, for reasons he understood now. The grief amplifier had made those conversations too costly, too emotionally overwhelming to approach head-on. Without it, the desire was clean and uncomplicated. Sirius looked at him. Something shifted in his face. Right now? You're not going anywhere. Neither am I. Sirius settled back in the chair and the lines of his face rearranged themselves into something that was almost relaxed. Your dad, he said. Where do I start? Anywhere. James was the most infuriating person I have ever known, Sirius said, and his voice had a quality in it that was love and grief and laughter all mixed together into something warm. And I include myself in that comparison, which should tell you something about the scale. He had this absolute certainty about himself. Not arrogance, not quite. More like he'd decided very young who he was going to be and never really doubted it after that. The confidence was real, that's the thing. It wasn't a performance. Did I get that from him? Harry asked. Sirius looked at him for a moment. You got something. I don't know if confident is the right word for what you've always had. James was confident like sunshine, just broadly present, making things grow. Even tonight, right now, after what just happened to you, you're something different. More focused. He paused. Your mother had that. Lily could walk into a room and identify the three most important problems in it before she'd taken her coat off. Your dad's confidence and your mother's precision. He shook his head. It's an interesting combination, is what it is. Harry thought about that. What would they have done tonight? If they'd been here. Your mother would have gone through the diagnostic report line by line and compiled a legal brief before anyone else had finished reading the first page, Sirius said immediately. Your father would have wanted to go to Dumbledore's office right then and confront him directly, and your mother would have told him to sit down and be strategic, and they would have argued about it for 20 minutes and then your dad would have done exactly what she said because she was usually right. He paused. And then they both would have been very, very angry. Not hysterical angry. Quiet angry. Which is worse? Harry nodded. You've got the quiet angry, Sirius observed. Yes, Harry agreed. He's going to underestimate you, Sirius said. Dumbledore. Whatever he's planning, whatever angle he takes tomorrow, he's going to be working from the Harry he built. The one who needs guidance. The one who trusts the wise old man with the plan. He doesn't know who you are yet. I know, Harry said. That's useful. Sirius looked at him steadily. Don't lose that. The moment he realizes, I'm not planning to hide anything, Harry said. I'm not going to pretend to still be what he made me. But there's a difference between letting him underestimate me and performing weakness I don't have. He paused. He should be able to see exactly who I am and still lose. That's what I want. Sirius stared at him for a moment and then said, very quietly, Merlin, you're going to be something else. Harry looked at the window again. The grounds were dark and still. Somewhere in the castle, in his round office full of whirring instruments and portraits of sleeping headmasters, Albus Dumbledore was awake, Harry was certain of it, sitting with whatever thoughts a man had when a scheme he'd been running for 65 years showed its first real crack. Harry felt no particular desire to imagine those thoughts charitably. The anger was there, quiet, as Sirius had noted, and clean rather than hot, a steady kind of fire that warmed without scorching. He was going to need it for what came next. He was going to need it controlled, which he found, sitting in the hospital wing past midnight with the last of the suppressors fading from his system, was not difficult. Anger he could feel clearly, without amplification, without the guilt matrix tangling it into paralysis, was just information. It told him what was wrong and why it needed to change, and then it sat there, patient, waiting to be useful. Tomorrow, Sirius said. It wasn't a question. Tomorrow we start, Harry said. Tonight was just the discovery. He looked at Sirius. It took him 65 years to build this. We have to dismantle it faster than that. How much faster? Sirius asked. Harry thought about Bones in the other room, about the 5 Wisengamot seats, about the investigation running through official channels, about the tournament and the coming months and everything Dumbledore was still in a position to do if they moved too slowly. 1 year, Harry said. 1 year to take apart 65. Sirius considered that. We're going to need allies, he said. We have some, Harry said. More than you'd think. He glanced at the door, where Proudfoot stood silently in the corridor. And we're going to make more. He let out a slow breath. But first, sleep. I want to be sharp tomorrow. You could try to sleep in an actual bed, Sirius said. Rather than a hospital one. Pomfrey will want to keep me overnight. Pomfrey, Sirius said, raising his voice slightly toward the office, might be persuaded to extend the concept of medical supervision to include the guest quarters adjacent to the hospital wing. From the office came a sound that was, distinctly, Pomfrey's controlled not quite laugh. The guest room is unlocked, Lord Black, she said. And there are extra blankets in the cedar chest. Sirius grinned. She likes me. Everyone likes you, Harry said. It's part of the problem, you've never had to work for anything. That is deeply unfair, Sirius said, and also possibly true. Harry lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling and listened to the castle settle into its deep nighttime sounds, the creak of old stone, the distant murmur of portraits, the particular quality of silence that a very large building full of sleeping people produced. Tomorrow the headmaster would request a meeting. Tomorrow Bones would file her paperwork. Tomorrow the first moves on a very large board would happen and the game would be visible to everyone who was playing it. Tonight, for the first time in his life, Harry's mind was quiet in the way a clear night was quiet, not empty, not dull, but clean, with everything in its right place and nothing pressing down from outside. He thought about the Sorting Hat. Slytherin would help you on the way to greatness. He'd said no. He'd said Gryffindor, please, and meant it, and the hat had put him there, and he'd always been glad of it. He was still glad of it. His bravery wasn't performed or constructed, he'd felt the fear of every dangerous thing and done it anyway, which was the only kind of bravery worth having. But the hat had seen something. It had seen a mind that understood strategy, that could see angles, that was capable of long-view thinking. He was beginning to think the hat had been right about that part. He closed his eyes. Outside the window the stars were doing what they'd been doing for 1 billion years, reliable and indifferent and vast, and somewhere 3 floors up a very old man was realizing, with whatever mix of feelings he was capable of, that the piece he'd spent 65 years moving was no longer where he'd put it. Harry slept. Chapter 3, The Architecture of Lies. The owl arrived at breakfast. Not to Harry, to every table simultaneously, which was the ministry's way of announcing something too significant to be delivered through normal channels. The parchment that unfolded above each house table was ministry stamped, bearing the official seal of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and the students who read it first went quiet in a particular way that spread outward from each reading point like ripples, until the entire great hall had a quality of held breath that Harry recognized as the sound of a large group of people realizing that something fundamental had changed. The notice stated, in precise ministry language that was nonetheless completely clear, that a formal investigation had been opened under the Magical Persons Protection Act of 1947 regarding unauthorized magical modification of a minor currently enrolled at Hogwarts School. No name was given. The notice further stated that Madame Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, would be conducting preliminary interviews at Hogwarts over the following 3 days, and that all staff members were requested to make themselves available. Harry watched the headmaster's face. Dumbledore was seated at the center of the staff table, and he read the notice with the expression of a man reading something mildly interesting, serene, thoughtful, faintly amused in the way he always seemed faintly amused by everything. His lemon drop sat untouched at his elbow. His half-moon spectacles caught the morning light. He looked precisely like what he had spent 65 years perfecting the appearance of, a wise, benevolent grandfather to a school, untroubled by anything so petty as institutional authority. Harry ate his eggs and watched him the way you watch a chess piece you're about to take. "Everyone's staring at you," Ron said, which was accurate. Half the hall was oscillating between the ministry notice and Harry's face, doing the obvious arithmetic. "Do you want to? Are we going to talk about last night? Because you didn't come back to the dormitory, and Fred and George said Pomfrey's wing had some kind of ward on it, and, yes," Harry said. "But not here. Later." Ron accepted this with the ease of someone who'd spent 4 years trusting Harry's judgment on when things could be said in public. It was only now, looking at that easy acceptance, that Harry wondered how much of Ron's instinctive deference to his lead was genuine friendship and how much had been constructed by a loyalty charm that nudged the Weasley family connection in specific directions. He hated that he had to wonder that. He'd decided, somewhere in the small hours of the morning, that wondering was better than not wondering. Uncertainty was uncomfortable but honest. The alternative was assuming everything was fine, which was exactly what 107 charms had spent 14 years making him do. Hermione was sitting across from him and she'd read the notice 3 times and her expression was doing something complicated. She was brilliant and she'd clearly already worked out that the notice was about Harry, and she was looking at him now with a mixture of concern and something else, something more uncomfortable, more self-examining. "Harry," she said quietly. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." He paused, deliberately. "Actually, that's a habit. Let me try again. I'm better than I've been in a long time. And there are things I need to tell you, but later, somewhere private." She looked at him steadily. "You sound different." "I know," he said. "You're not wrong. At the staff table, McGonagall had received a separate piece of parchment, hand-delivered by a ministry owl specifically to her, and she'd read it and set it down and was now looking at Harry with an expression that was deeply unfamiliar on her face because it was, unmistakably, guilt. Harry caught her eye. He held it for a moment and then gave her a small, deliberate nod, not forgiving, not yet, but acknowledging, which was different, and watched her shoulders drop half an inch in a way that told him she'd been waiting to see what he'd do when he looked at her. McGonagall had known something. He wasn't certain how much. But she'd known something. He filed it. The morning's classes were, under the circumstances, almost insultingly ordinary. Harry sat through double potions with the Slytherins and noticed that his response to the dungeon classroom, the cold stone walls, the sour smell of old ingredients, the anticipatory tension of waiting for Snape to walk in, was functionally different. The old dread was gone. Not replaced by warmth, but by something clear and level that let him sit in his seat without his jaw tightening. Snape swept in, robes settling, and ran his gaze across the class in the way he always did, a cold, cataloging look that landed on Harry last and stayed there slightly longer than anyone else, his default opening move. Harry met it without tension, without the automatic defensive bristling, and something crossed Snape's face that was too quick and too controlled to read properly but was definitely there. Harry thought, he can feel that something's different. He doesn't know what yet. Potter, Snape said, in the tone he usually reserved for identifying something unpleasant on the sole of a shoe. The strengthening solution. Properties. Now. Harry recited them. Completely, correctly, without the slight nervous rush that usually accompanied being called on by Snape, the anxiety-driven verbal stumbling that Snape used as evidence of Potter's endemic stupidity. He recited them at a measured pace, looking at Snape directly, and watched Snape have nowhere to go with the answer. 5 points to Gryffindor, Snape said, with the particular intonation of a man awarding points to Gryffindor against his better judgment, and moved on. Ron mouthed what across the worktop. Harry shook his head slightly and began measuring lacewing flies. He was thinking about Snape and the 11 loyalty markers. He was thinking about how Snape had built his entire adult identity around the choice to defect from Voldemort to Dumbledore's side, a choice that defined him, that he had apparently made at great personal cost, that formed the bedrock of whatever self-conception he still had access to. And some of that choice, some of the emotional infrastructure that had made it feel so absolute and so unquestionable, had been put there by Dumbledore's wand. The moral question was interesting. If you removed a man's compulsion to be loyal, and he remained loyal anyway out of genuine conviction, was the original compulsion a crime or irrelevant? And if the compulsion had done the work, if the genuine conviction would have been shakier or differently oriented without it, what did Snape actually owe the man who'd both used him and shaped his ability to choose? Harry didn't have a clean answer. He suspected Snape was going to need to find one himself. After potions, in the corridor heading to Transfiguration, a second-year Hufflepuff intercepted Harry with a note sealed in the distinctive dark blue wax of administrative correspondence. It was from Amelia Bones, written in a hand that matched her personality, compact, efficient, completely without flourish. Harry folded the note. He went to Transfiguration. McGonagall taught the lesson with her customary precision and her uncharacteristic distraction. She dropped a piece of chalk twice, which in 4 years of observation was unprecedented, and she called Neville by the wrong name before correcting herself with a briskness that fooled no one. At the end of class she said, "Mr. Potter," a moment, while the others filed out, and Hermione lingered in the doorway with an expression that asked a question Harry answered with a slight shake of his head. She left. McGonagall stood behind her desk with her hands clasped on the surface in front of her and looked at him with the expression of a woman who had rehearsed this conversation and found every version of it inadequate. "I received correspondence this morning," she said. "From Bones?" Harry asked. She blinked. "From the headmaster, actually. He is concerned. He believes there has been a misinterpretation of diagnostic results and he intends to, Professor McGonagall," Harry said. Not unkindly, but without leaving room for the conversation to go somewhere comfortable. Can I ask you something directly? She stiffened slightly. Of course. When I arrived at Hogwarts, did you know that I was carrying any kind of behavioral modification magic? The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. He counted. No, she said. Not specifically. I knew. She stopped. Pressed her lips together. Apparently decided that he had earned honesty. I knew that the headmaster had taken considerable personal interest in the arrangements surrounding your life. Before and after your parents' deaths. I raised certain questions, over the years, about the manner in which you were being prepared. The word cost her something. My questions were answered satisfactorily, or so I believed at the time. I would characterize myself as someone who trusted a man I had known for 40 years not to cross certain lines. She paused. I was perhaps not asking the right questions. Harry looked at her steadily. You knew enough to wonder and not enough to act. She met his eyes. Yes. That is an accurate summary. That's not nothing, Harry said. But it's not enough. I need to know if I can trust you going forward, Professor. Not as a student trusts a teacher. Actually trust you. McGonagall looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Something in her face shifted, the professional armor moving aside enough to show the person underneath, who was genuinely angry at herself and genuinely uncertain, and who was looking at Harry Potter with the dawning recognition that she was dealing with someone she had significantly miscalculated. You have my word, she said. For whatever it is worth. I think it's worth quite a lot, actually, Harry said. That's why I asked. He left her to sit with that. At 11 he was outside the door of the conference room Bones had requisitioned, a seldom used administrative space on the second floor, when Snape arrived. They had not been in the same space since potions that morning. Snape stopped when he saw Harry standing by the door, which was somewhat inevitable since neither of them had known the other would be there. They looked at each other. The silence had a different quality than any silence that had ever existed between them before. Without the aversion charm's automatic hostility, without the suppressor making Harry's strategic mind slightly too slow to handle the encounter without anxiety, and, Harry realized, without whatever Snape was feeling when he looked at Harry that was shaped by 11 loyalty markers he'd never consented to, the moment was almost honest. Snape said, Potter. It was his standard opening. It meant approximately nothing by itself. Professor, Harry said. He paused, and then, because there was no useful reason not to, do you know why you're being interviewed? Snape's eyes narrowed. I was told it concerns the investigation into magical modification of a minor. I have certain logical deductions about which minor. He paused. Do you know why I'm being interviewed? Yes, Harry said simply. Snape studied him with the same dark evaluating look he always used on Harry in class. But stripped of whatever the loyalty charms had been doing to the chemistry between them, the look was just, intelligent. It was a smart man reading a situation with the full weight of his considerable analytical ability. You look different, Potter, Snape said. So I'm told. Not aesthetically. Something in the behavioral signature. He said it like a man who was deeply familiar with behavioral signatures and exactly what differences in them indicated. His expression did something very controlled and very subtle. How many? He asked. Harry blinked. Then, you can read that? I have been researching behavioral modification magic for the better part of 2 decades, Snape said, with the particular flatness of someone who has said something that reveals more than they intended and has decided to let it stand. There are reasons. I would prefer not to enumerate them in a corridor. He paused. How many? 107, Harry said. Snape's face didn't change. His eyes did, something moving through them that was very briefly, very visibly not controlled at all, before the control came back. What is the current status of those markers? He said. Cleared. Last night. St. Mungo's specialist. Another silence. And the signature? Snape's voice was doing something Harry had never heard from him before, a quality of careful, surgical neutrality, the tone of a man who needs to hear an answer and is terrified of what it will be. Harry said, quietly, "You know whose signature it would be." Snape turned away. He faced the wall beside the conference room door, which was hung with a thoroughly unremarkable painting of a meadow, and he stood there for approximately 5 seconds doing something entirely internal that Harry couldn't read but respected enough to not interrupt. When Snape turned back, his face was the blankiest Harry had ever seen it. Not the sneering blank he used in class, but a fundamental blankness, everything wiped because nothing could be displayed without cost. "I see," he said. "You should know," Harry said carefully, "that you also show markers." 11. Mostly loyalty constructs. Bones's investigation will cover them. Snape stared at him. "Healer Marchbanks can clear them," Harry continued. "If you want her to. That's entirely your decision. But the information is yours." Something passed through Snape's expression that was, briefly and unmistakably, grief. Not the sharp kind. The old kind, that had been sitting somewhere very deep for a very long time. "Do you understand," Snape said, very quietly, "what you're telling me?" "Yes," Harry said. "I think I do. Every choice I believed I made, you don't know that yet," Harry said. "Neither do I. The charms amplify and redirect, they don't necessarily manufacture wholesale. Some of what you chose might still be yours. Probably a lot of it. But you deserve to know which parts are." He paused. "That's what she didn't give either of us. The chance to actually choose." Snape looked at him for a long moment. "Your father," he said slowly, "could barely string together a coherent argument without the help of a quaffle." Harry almost smiled. "I know. I take after my mother, apparently." Something moved across Snape's face that was involuntary and real and over very quickly. "Yes," Snape said quietly. "You do." He straightened, rearranged himself back into his habitual armor. "I am going into this interview now, Potter. I would advise you not to read anything into that." "I won't," Harry said. Snape opened the conference room door and went in. Harry waited in the corridor, and heard through the closed door the sound of Amelia Bones beginning her interview with the particular calm precision of a woman who had been wanting to ask these questions for a long time. Harry went to find Sirius. He was in the room Dumbledore had supposedly provided as guest quarters, one of the rarely used suites on the 3rd floor that the castle seemed to expand into when it felt like it. Sirius had apparently spent the morning making contacts, because when Harry arrived he found him at a writing desk with 3 separate owls waiting patiently on a perch conjured from the wardrobe door, a half-eaten plate of toast beside him, and 6 outgoing letters sealed with the Black family seal, a complicated device that Harry had never seen used before in his life, a black field with a tapestry of silver stars. "Who are you writing to?" Harry asked, dropping into the chair across from him. "People who've been waiting a long time for the Black family to start functioning again," Sirius said, pressing the last seal. "My mother turned the family into a monument to pureblood paranoia and drove away everyone with sense. My father was spineless. My brother," he paused briefly. "Regulus had his moments, but he made a choice that killed him before he could do anything about it. The family has been functionally dead for 15 years. Dead families accumulate debts and favors and obligations on both sides." He held up one of the letters. "The Greengrass family. Traditional, not extremist, owed the Blacks a significant material favor dating to 1967. They've been waiting for someone to either call it in or forgive it. I'm calling it in, specifically in the form of political support." Harry looked at the other sealed envelopes. "And the others?" "Bones herself, confirming the Wisengamot seat registration she started last night. Ollivanders, to formally notify them of a change in family head that affects certain property registrations. There's a wand-making contract from 1823 that's technically still active and gives the Blacks influence over certain ministry crafting licenses that I intend to use as leverage." The Abbots, another traditional family, their head owes Sirius Black a personal debt from before Azkaban that he'll be extremely uncomfortable not paying. And two to individuals in Europe who are aware of certain things about Dumbledore's history that haven't made it into the British record. He looked up. Also, I ordered breakfast for both of us. It should arrive shortly. Harry stared at him. When did you become a political strategist? I've always been a political strategist, Sirius said, with something that was both defensive and very slightly pleased with himself. I was just a reckless disaster. Deliberately counterculturally uninterested in exercising it, Sirius corrected, with dignity. Also, Azkaban gave me a lot of time to think about what I'd do if I ever got out. The answer, apparently, is correspondence. He set down the last letter. Bones's filing was confirmed an hour ago, by the way. Both seats are registered. You're Lord Potter as of 9:15 this morning. Harry sat with that for a moment. Lord Potter. It sat oddly, not badly, just oddly, the way new clothes sat before they'd been worn a few times. Right, he said. Then we need to talk about the Wisengamot approach, because Bones said we'd need 14 uncommitted votes, Sirius said. Yes. I've been thinking about that. The problem isn't the number, we can reach 14 with the right allies. The problem is the Chief Warlock position itself. Even under investigation, Dumbledore retains that seat unless the Wisengamot votes to suspend it, which requires, of all the self-serving pieces of institutional design I've ever seen, a 2/3 majority. Which he controls, Harry said. Which he currently controls, Sirius said. But the beautiful thing about a 2/3 majority is that you don't have to flip it wholesale. You only have to move enough people into genuine uncertainty. 14 uncommitted votes in a body of 50 shifts the math significantly if even 6 of them move. And if the investigation produces evidence that Bones can put in front of them, it will, Harry said with certainty. Sirius looked at him. You sound very confident. Because the evidence exists. It's in my diagnostic report. 107 charms, 65 years of history, and a signature that matches the Chief Warlock's documented magical pattern. Harry leaned forward. Sirius, he didn't hide it. I don't think he believed he needed to. He's been above scrutiny for so long that the possibility of this, of someone finding it and not being manageable, probably didn't feel like a real risk. Arrogance, Sirius said. Certainty, Harry corrected. There's a difference. Arrogance knows it might be wrong and doesn't care. What he has is, he genuinely believes he's right. He genuinely believes that everything he's done is necessary and good and that the outcome justifies it. That's harder to defend against in some ways, because he's not performing a lie. He believes the story. Sirius was quiet for a moment. Does that make it better or worse? Worse, Harry said without hesitation. Because it means he'll keep believing it even when presented with evidence that he's wrong. He'll interpret everything through the lens of the greater good and find a way to make it fit. He paused. Which means we can't just present the evidence and expect him to collapse. We need to dismantle the structure publicly, in front of people who have the power to act on what they see. The trial, Sirius said. Yes. The breakfast arrived via house elf and they ate while the owls shuffled and waited and the fire in the grate said quietly domestic things that were wildly out of keeping with the conversation. When they'd finished, Harry looked up from his plate. There's something else, he said. Something I've been turning over since last night. Tell me. The Horcruxes, Harry said. Sirius went still. You know about them? Harry asked. I know the word, Sirius said carefully. Darkest magic there is. The splitting of a soul through murder and its anchoring to an object. You're saying, Voldemort, Harry said. He should be dead. He was hit by his own killing curse. He's not dead. He's in something in Albania, or was, or whatever form he exists in right now. And I've been sitting in this school for 4 years with a scar on my head that reacts to him, that gives me his emotions, that hurts when he's close, and no adult has ever sat me down and said, here is the actual explanation for why Tom Riddle is still alive. Because the explanation requires admitting certain things, Sirius said slowly. He was working through it in real time. Harry could see the process in his face. The explanation, Harry said, is that there are multiple anchors. Multiple objects that are keeping him tethered. And my scar, he pressed 2 fingers to the lightning bolt on his forehead, is a scar. On my magical core, in a very specific location. Courtesy of a killing curse that bounced. He met Sirius's eyes. What would a charm reversal specialist's diagnostic make of a scar produced by a killing curse, on the magical core of a child, if she happened to look at it closely? The silence in the room was absolute. Sirius set down his fork very deliberately. Harry, he said. I'm not certain, Harry said. I need a specialized diagnostic to confirm it. But the logic is consistent. The curse hit me. Something survived that shouldn't have survived. Something has been sitting in my scar for 13 years. And Dumbledore has known, I am very confident he has known, exactly what it is and what it means. He paused. Which is why the guilt matrix and the sacrifice acceptance programming are the most important charms in the diagnostic list. Not incidentally important. Fundamentally important. He was preparing me to walk to my death and not flinch from it. The fire crackled. Sirius was doing something with his expression that was clearly about controlling what he felt about what Harry had just said, and it was clearly very difficult. If you're right, Sirius said, very carefully. The situation still has a solution, Harry said. Obviously it does. Because I'm not walking to my death. That was the plan someone else built for me. I'll build my own plan. Sirius stared at him for a long moment. You're 14 years old, Sirius said, not accusingly but with something in it that might have been a complicated kind of odd. I know, Harry said. I haven't actually forgotten that. But I've apparently been carrying the intellectual capacity of someone significantly older for quite a while and simply been prevented from using it. He paused. Which means I have a lot of ground to cover quickly. A knock at the door. They both looked up. Sirius called out and Healer Marchbanks appeared in the doorway, carrying her case and looking slightly more ruffled than she had the previous night. I heard you might want a follow-up, she said to Harry. Specifically regarding certain, structural anomalies in the scar tissue of your cursed scar. Harry looked at her steadily. Bones sent you. Bones suggested it, Marchbanks said. I agreed. I should have run a full core structure scan last night but we were somewhat focused on the modification markers. She set her case down. Will you let me? Yes, Harry said. She worked for 20 minutes. Sirius sat very still. Harry lay on the narrow couch that had been transfigured from a footstool at some point in the morning and stared at the ceiling and felt the diagnostic magic moving through him in a different pattern than the previous night, deeper, slower, more focused, spiraling specifically toward the scar. When Marchbanks said nothing for 3 full minutes after her wand had stilled, Harry said, How bad? She exhaled. It's not good. There is a fragment of foreign magical presence embedded in the scar tissue. Old, dormant, but present. The signature is, she stopped. Looked up from the diagnostic readout. I need to take this to the specialists at St. Mungo's. I need someone who works specifically with soul magic. Is it removable? Harry asked. Theoretically, yes. Practically, it needs to be destroyed rather than simply removed, which requires specific magic. She met his eyes. There's a precedent in the 1450 texts. Basilisk venom is the most commonly cited mechanism. Also fiend fire. And, she paused. What? Sirius said sharply. There's a third option in the theoretical literature, Marchbanks said carefully. If the host survives, specifically survives, the death and revival cycle of certain ancient magics. But the only mechanism that produces that in modern practice is the killing curse itself, which, no, Sirius said flatly. Obviously not a recommended treatment plan, Marchbanks agreed hastily. But it is documented. Harry stared at the ceiling and thought about Dumbledore, who had known about the fragment in his scar and whose plan had involved a killing curse in the endgame, not as a last resort, not as a tragedy to be avoided, but as a deliberate engineering choice disguised as prophecy and sacrifice and the greater good. He thought, he was going to tell me at the last possible moment. When I had no time to find another way. He thought, I have time now. Basilisk venom, Harry said. There's a dead basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets. I killed it second year. There should be venom still viable in the fangs. Basilisk venom doesn't degrade. He looked at Marchbanks. Is that a workable extraction scenario? Marchbanks stared at him. Yes, theoretically, but the chamber, I can open it, Harry said simply. I'm a Parselmouth. Another one of those silences. Sirius said, very slowly, of course you are. Dumbledore knows that too, Harry said. It's part of the scar's influence, the foreign presence carried Parseltongue as a secondary magical expression. Which Dumbledore absolutely knew, which means he knew the nature of what was in the scar, which means he knew exactly what the scar was. He sat up. Right, he said. 3 things to do today. First, I need to be present when Dumbledore goes in for his 2 o'clock interview with Bones. Not inside the room. Outside, where he can see me in the corridor when he arrives. I want him to know that I know, and I want him to have to manage that knowledge while being interviewed under formal inquiry conditions. He looked at Sirius. Second, tonight, Chamber of Secrets. You, me, Marchbanks if she's willing, to retrieve basilisk fangs for venom extraction. Absolutely, Sirius said, in a tone that suggested he had been waiting for someone to suggest something decisively reckless. Third, Harry said. Hermione. Ron. I need to talk to them today. Properly. All of it. He paused. They deserve to know. And I need to know if the friendships are real once all of it's on the table. Sirius nodded. And if they are? Then they'll want to help, Harry said. And they'll be useful. Hermione especially, she's been doing more research at more depth than anyone gives her credit for because everyone around her has been conditioned to see her as rule enforcement rather than intellectual firepower. Remove that filter and she's formidable. He thought for a moment. She's been carrying charms too, Sirius. Not behavioral modification, nothing on her directly. But she's been an instrument in my conditioning without knowing it. That's going to be difficult for her. She'll be furious, Sirius said. Yes, Harry said. And then she'll channel the fury into research so thorough it'll make the Ministry's evidence file look like a pamphlet. He almost smiled. Which is exactly what we need. He met Marchbanks's eyes. Will you help us? The chamber tonight. She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a healer calculating risk against benefit with the entire weight of her professional training on one side and something more personal on the other. I spent 6 years at St. Mungo's watching cases come in that should have been investigated and weren't, she said. Children with modification markers that the system classified as too complicated to pursue. Cases that got closed when certain names appeared in the signatures. She picked up her case and snapped it shut. Yes, Mr. Potter. I will help you. What time? After dinner, Harry said. 10 o'clock. He stood, squared his shoulders, and looked out the window at the grounds, the same view as from the hospital wing, just from a different angle, the castle being that kind of place. The lake. The forest. The Quidditch pitch in the middle distance. I want to go to the library, he said. Sirius looked at him. Now. After all of, specifically the restricted section, Harry said. I have a valid medical research authorization Marchbanks can sign, and I want to pull everything they have on soul magic, Horcrux theory, and the specific texts on magical modification law from 1823 that Bones mentioned. He looked at Sirius. And then I want to be standing in that corridor at 1:55, in plain sight, when Dumbledore walks past. Sirius stood, rolled his shoulders, and looked like a man who had just found the thing he was supposed to be doing. "I'll come to the library with you," he said. "I was actually quite good at research, once." Remus always got the credit because he did it quietly and I did it with commentary, but still. "Commentary is fine," Harry said. "Let's go." They went, and the castle received them the way it always had, the way it had received Harry for 4 years, the corridors making room, the portraits watching, the staircases shifting with their endless internal logic. But Harry moved through it differently now. Not cautiously, not with the slightly braced quality of someone expecting the next crisis. He moved through Hogwarts like someone who understood his relationship to the place and had decided what it was going to be going forward. At 1:55, with 3 hours of research behind him and 3 specific texts under a temporary borrowing authorization in his bag, Harry took up a position in the corridor outside the second-floor conference room. At 1:58, Albus Dumbledore came around the corner. He was wearing deep purple robes with silver embroidery, which was his formal choice for occasions he wished to approach with gravitas. His expression was composed, and it was a very good composition, serene, slightly regretful, carrying the air of a wise man who has been asked to explain something that the askers are not quite equipped to understand, but who will do so patiently. He saw Harry. The composition didn't break. It never did, with Dumbledore. But something behind his eyes shifted, an almost imperceptible recalculation, fast as a computer, running the new variables. Harry standing here, unscheduled, outside the interview room. Harry's posture, his expression. The absence of the things Dumbledore's charms had put there, the slight uncertainty, the reflexive deference, the 12-year-old's need to look to the wise man for direction. What Dumbledore saw, standing in that corridor, was not the boy he'd built. Harry held his gaze and said nothing, and the saying nothing did more work than any words would have. Dumbledore stopped a few feet away. He tilted his head slightly, the way he always did. "Harry," he said, warmly. "I had hoped we might speak privately before, my answer's the same as last night," Harry said. "Not privately." Dumbledore looked at him. Really looked at him. And Harry watched, in real time, in the space of about 3 seconds, the full weight of 65 years of planning meet the reality of Harry James Potter with every lock removed, and begin, very quietly, to understand the problem. "I see," Dumbledore said, which was what Snape had said that morning, and the similarity was not something Harry found funny. "I know you do," Harry said. "Go ahead in, sir. Bones is waiting." Dumbledore looked at him for one more moment. The half-moon spectacles caught the corridor's light. The expression on his face was something Harry couldn't entirely read, it was too complex, too layered, too old. But somewhere in it was something that might have been, underneath everything else, recognition. He turned and went into the conference room. The door closed. Harry stood in the corridor and listened to the latch click, and then he turned and walked back toward the library, because there was more to read and not enough hours left in the day. Chapter 4, The Board Moves. The Chamber of Secrets smelled like old stone and ancient water and something else underneath, a biological heaviness that Harry recognized from second year and had spent 2 years trying not to think about too carefully. He went first, because he was the only one who could open it, and because going first was simply what he did, and also because without the instinct suppressor quietly sanding down his threat assessment, he'd realized that going first was actually the correct tactical choice when you were the most capable person in a group entering a dangerous space. It had always been the right call. He just hadn't previously been able to see it clearly as a choice rather than a reflexive lunge. The chamber opened for him in the girls' bathroom on the second floor, the sink grinding back, the pipe yawning dark, and Harry speaking the Parseltongue descent command in a low hiss that made Sirius's expression do something between fascinated and slightly alarmed, which Harry filed as something he'd tease him about later. Marchbanks went second, steady on her feet in a way that suggested her training at St. Mungo's had included environments considerably less sanitized than a hospital ward. Sirius went last, his wand out, and Harry heard him mutter something in the pipe about the quality of wizarding infrastructure that echoed down to him in fragments. The main chamber was as Harry remembered it, the long pillared corridor, the statues, the shed basilisk skin that was still vast and papery and deeply unsettling, and at the far end, in the antechamber, the dead basilisk itself. 12 years dead. Still enormous. The scales had gone dusty but the structure was intact, and when Marchbanks crouched beside the massive head with her diagnostic tools and a very well-lit lumos, she said, "The venom's viable. The glands are still pressurized, basilisk venom can maintain potency in situ for up to a century." "Good," Harry said. "The fangs are another matter. The ones nearest the venom glands will carry the highest concentration. I'll need to extract at the root." She looked up at him. "You killed this at 12. 11, technically, by the time, yes." Marchbanks looked at the basilisk. She looked at Harry. She went back to the extraction without further comment, which Harry respected. Sirius had been walking the perimeter of the antechamber, wand raised, cataloguing. He stopped at the carved stone face of Salazar Slytherin, which was 17 feet high and possessed of an expression that suggested Salazar had spent his life deeply disappointed in everyone around him. "Friendly sort," he said. "The basilisk came out of the mouth," Harry said. "Of course it did." Sirius turned from the statue. "Harry. While she's working, tell me what you found in the library." Harry had spent the 3 hours after watching Dumbledore walk into Bones's interview reading with the focus speed that apparently came naturally to him when his cognitive suppressor wasn't running. He'd covered soul magic theory, Horcrux structure, and the 1823 magical persons charter that governed the rights and legal standing of minor lords. He'd also, through a combination of specific cross-referencing, found something that he hadn't known to look for before and which had changed the shape of several things. "The prophecy," Harry said. "I've been thinking about it since the hospital wing and I went through every text on seer magic I could reach. Trelawney made the original prophecy, the one Dumbledore treats as the blueprint for everything, in 1980. It was overheard. By someone who was then a Death Eater. Who reported it. That's how Voldemort heard it, and targeted my family." "Yes," Sirius said. "I know that much." "The person who overheard it," Harry said, "was Snape." Sirius went very still. "He was there applying for a position," Harry continued. "He heard the beginning of it and was caught and removed before he heard the full content. He reported what he'd heard to Voldemort, and then, and this is the part that actually matters, he went to Dumbledore. And Dumbledore, according to Snape's own account to the Order, agreed to protect my mother. Specifically my mother." He paused. "Not my father. Not me. My mother. Lily," Sirius said quietly. "Snape loved my mother," Harry said. It still sat strangely to say it, not painfully, just strangely, the way new information always sat. And Dumbledore used that. He accepted Snape's defection because it was useful, and he offered Snape the thing Snape wanted most, protection for Lily, and then he didn't actually deliver it. "My mother died. My father died. I survived." And Snape was left carrying a grief and a guilt that Dumbledore subsequently reinforced with loyalty charms and redirected into usefulness. "He turned Snape's greatest failure into a leash," Sirius said, and his voice had a quality in it that Harry hadn't heard before, not anger, something colder than anger. "Yes," Harry said. "And that's what I mean when I say it's brilliant and monstrous simultaneously. He didn't manufacture a servant. He found a man's deepest wound and made himself indispensable to it." He looked at Sirius directly. "Snape has been running himself ragged for 13 years on loyalty charms and guilt and grief and the belief that serving Dumbledore is serving Lily's memory. When those charms come off, he's going to have a very difficult few weeks, Sirius said quietly. He deserves better than what he got, Harry said. From Dumbledore specifically. My opinion of Snape as a person is complicated and unresolved. But nobody deserves to have their grief weaponized against them for a decade. Sirius looked at him for a long moment with the expression Harry was beginning to recognize as what Sirius's face did when he was recalibrating who Harry was in real time. You're going to offer him something, aren't you? Sirius said. Not a question. I'm going to give him information, Harry said. What he does with it is his. Your mother would have done exactly that, Sirius said softly, and then looked away and didn't say anything else. Marchbanks finished the extraction with careful, practiced movements, sealing the collected venom into a reinforced phial with a stasis charm, then a second, then a third. Enough for the diagnostic work and the treatment process, she said, standing and putting away her tools. I'll coordinate with St. Mungo's Soul Magic Department. We're probably looking at a procedure in 3 to 4 weeks, it needs specific preparation. That's fine, Harry said. We have other things to do in the meantime. They climbed back out through the pipe, Marchbanks with equipment-laden dignity, Sirius with considerably more commentary, and the bathroom seal closed behind them with a quiet grinding finality that felt, to Harry, like closing a chapter. The Wisengamot session was in 6 days. He knew, because Bones had told him that morning over a breakfast she'd eaten at Pomfrey's desk between interviews, that she'd filed the preliminary investigation report with the full body, mandatory under the Magical Persons Protection Act when the subject of the investigation held an official position. Dumbledore would face questions at the next session. Not a trial, not yet, but formal questions, on record, in front of 50 voting members and the gallery above. In 6 days. Harry had things to do. The next morning started with Hermione. He'd asked her and Ron to meet him in the room of requirement after breakfast, and the room had given him what he needed, a comfortable space with a table and chairs and enough morning light through conjured windows to make a difficult conversation feel less like an interrogation. He'd asked Sirius to be present. He hadn't told them that Sirius would be there, partly because the surprise would be useful and partly because Ron's reaction to an actual Sirius Black appearance was reliably disarming. Ron gaped. Hermione immediately tried not to gape, failed, and recovered with a precision that was distinctly her. Sirius grinned and said, "Hello, you two," and then looked at Harry because this was Harry's conversation. Harry told them everything. He started with the diagnostic, moved through the 107 charms, covered their types and functions and implications, explained what had changed in him since the removal, and then, here was the part that had cost him the most thought in preparation, he told them about the loyalty charms and what they implied for their friendships. He didn't soften it, because he'd decided that softening it would be a disrespect. Hermione deserved the actual information. So did Ron. The silence after he finished was long enough to have geography. Ron broke it first, which was surprising. So when I just, immediately liked you, on the train. First year. And I was the one who found you in the compartment. You might have found me anyway, Harry said carefully. The charm created a predisposition toward the Weasley family connection. It didn't invent you, Ron. It may have nudged the path. But you don't know, Ron said. No, Harry said honestly. I don't know exactly where the line is. I know what I feel now, which is that sitting across from you doesn't feel different. You feel like my friend. I'm telling you this because you deserve to decide for yourself whether that's enough. Ron sat with that for a moment. Harry had always known, a kind of emotional directness that was easily misread as simplicity but was actually something rarer, the ability to feel things clearly and respond to them honestly without a lot of narrative dressing. He looked at Harry and said, "I'm angry at him. Not at you. I'm bloody furious, actually." He paused. Are we going to do something about it? Yes, Harry said. Then I'm in, Ron said, with the straightforward simplicity of someone who has done his moral calculation and arrived at an answer that he's entirely comfortable with. Hermione hadn't spoken. She was sitting very still with her hands folded on the table in front of her and her expression doing something Harry recognized as the face she made when she was processing something at full speed and the processing was not comfortable. He waited. "The deference charm," she said finally. "The one that made you defer to my judgment on rule following and authority." "Yes," Harry said. Harry, she stopped. Pressed her lips together. Started again. "That means every time I told you something was against the rules, and you listened, and I felt like I'd helped, you did help, often," Harry said. "The charm amplified the weight of your authority. It didn't make you wrong. But I was being used as an instrument of control," she said, and her voice had something in it that was very close to the surface. "I was being positioned to keep you compliant without knowing it. Every time I said, 'Harry, we can't, it's against the rules,' and you backed down, you didn't know," Harry said firmly. "Hermione. This is not something you did to me. Someone else did this and used you as a tool for it. The only person responsible is the person who set it up." She looked at him directly and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was adjacent to them, the controlled emotional response of someone who cries from intellectual injury more than physical pain. "I should have questioned more," she said. "I should have wondered why I was always the one applying the brakes. Why the rules always felt so important in your specific situation." "You're questioning now," Harry said. She looked at him. She looked at Sirius. She looked back at Harry, and something shifted in her, the calcification that had always characterized her relationship to institutional authority, the reflexive assumption that the rules existed for good reasons and that Dumbledore represented those reasons, cracked cleanly and didn't close again. "Right," she said, and her voice had changed, still Hermione, still precise, but with the control pointed somewhere new. "Tell me about the Horcruxes. Everything you know and everything you theorize, and then I'm going to the library." Harry almost smiled. "That's why I wanted you here." What followed was 2 hours of conversation that moved with the speed and momentum of three people whose intelligence had been operating in partial formation finally operating together without restriction. Hermione took notes. Ron contributed strategic observations that people consistently undervalued because they arrived without academic vocabulary but were often the most direct path through a problem. Sirius provided historical context and personal knowledge about the individuals involved that no library could supply. By the end of it, they had a working theory of the Horcrux structure, how many, what likely objects, and what the destruction timeline looked like. They had a list of Wisengamot members to research. They had a strategy for the session in 6 days that was more sophisticated than anything Harry had managed to produce alone. "The diary was the first," Hermione said, tapping her notes. "Destroyed second year. The ring, you said Dumbledore's hand looks damaged, specifically his right hand, and has since last year?" "He started wearing a ring with a large black stone," Harry said. "And his hand has been, wrong, since the summer. Discolored. He found a Horcrux and tried to destroy it himself," Hermione said. "And whatever he used, it wasn't sufficient. If he'd had basilisk venom," she stopped. "He'd been trying to handle this alone." "Of course he has. He's been trying to handle everything alone for 65 years. The difference," Harry said, "is that when he handles things alone, other people pay the price." "What about the locket?" Sirius said. "Regulus. My brother Regulus, I told you he made a choice that killed him. I found his room at Grimmauld Place, years ago, cleaned it out. There was, I remember, a locket I couldn't open. Heavy. Made creature agitated, but creature was always agitated. He stopped. I threw it out." A silence. "When?" Harry said. "Summer before your 5th year, if it had been," Sirius said. He was looking pale. "I cleaned the house. It went into a rubbish bag. Mundungus Fletcher was hanging around. Mundungus would have nicked anything valuable," Harry said immediately. "It's not gone. If it's as significant as we think," it'll have wound up somewhere. We can find it. He looked at Sirius steadily. This isn't your fault. Tell that to my dead brother, Sirius said quietly. Regulus died trying to destroy it, Harry said. He figured it out before any of us. That's not a failure. He was trying to fix it. Sirius looked at him for a long moment and then nodded once, shortly, and stared at his hands. Harry gave him a moment and then continued, because the conversation needed to move. Here's the full list as best we can reconstruct it. The diary, destroyed. The ring, Dumbledore's found it, likely damaged it, possibly destroyed it improperly, we don't know. The locket, Mundungus, location unknown but findable. The cup, Bellatrix's vault, Gringotts, not accessible immediately but not impossible. The diadem, I think it's in the castle. There's a room on the 7th floor, the room of requirement, Hermione said immediately. Its storage aspect. Yes. I've never looked in there deliberately but I've felt something when I've walked past the wall. He touched his scar briefly. This is the 6th. Possibly the 7th is the snake, Nagini. And then Voldemort himself. He looked at the table. 7 anchors. 3 confirmed destroyed or damaged. 4 to locate and deal with. And 1 inch, he touched his forehead again, to remove by medical procedure before the final confrontation. The timeline, Ron said. He wasn't looking at his notes, just thinking. Voldemort's getting stronger. He's going to have a body again soon, isn't he? This tournament, yes, Harry said. Someone entered my name in the Goblet of Fire specifically. A Death Eater, working to a plan. The tournament ends with a portkey and a ritual. I've worked out enough of it from the research I did yesterday. He paused. Which means I have until June. 8 months, Hermione said. 8 months, Harry agreed. To clear 4 Horcruxes, take apart Dumbledore's political structure, and manage the return of Voldemort in a controlled way rather than on someone else's terms. He looked at the 3 of them. The priority order matters. The Wisengamot session is first, because political standing gives us everything else. Cover of law, access to resources, protection from the kind of interference that can shut this down before it starts. 6 days, Ron said. 6 days, Harry confirmed. He looked at Sirius. Your letters. The Greengrass family and the Abbots, have you heard back? Greengrass confirmed this morning, Sirius said, recovered now, his voice steady. Cyrus Greengrass will attend and his vote is conditional on the evidence presented but he's sympathetic. Abbott confirmed yesterday. That's 7 committed votes including ours. Plus whatever bones can shift from the uncommitted block. What's Dumbledore doing? Ron asked. He's not just sitting there, right? No, Harry said. He's making calls. He'll be working his block, reassuring people, framing the investigation as politically motivated. He'll probably try to request a postponement of the session. He looked at Sirius. Can he get it? Chief Warlock has the right to call a procedural delay of up to 14 days, Sirius said. But not while under active investigation. There's a 1931 precedent where Eugenia Jenkins successfully argued that a chief warlock using procedural tools to delay their own accountability was an abuse of position. It was upheld. Hermione, Harry said. She was already writing. I'll have the full precedent documented by tomorrow morning, she said, without looking up. The Jenkins ruling and its subsequent applications. Thank you. Harry stood. This afternoon. I need to speak to Snape. The others absorbed this in varying ways. Ron looked like he'd bitten into something unexpectedly sour but was attempting to pretend otherwise. Hermione looked like she was recalibrating her entire file on Severus Snape in real time, which she probably was. Sirius looked like he was choosing, carefully, not to say several things. Should I be there? Sirius asked. No, Harry said. This one's private. It needs to be. He found Snape in his office after lunch. The door was open, which was either an invitation or an oversight, and Harry knocked on the frame and waited. Snape looked up from the parchment he was marking, red ink, aggressive marginal comments, thoroughly in character, and his expression cycled through several things before settling into something neutral. Potter. He set down the quill. I was wondering when you'd appear. May I come in? Something moved through Snape's expression at the courtesy. He gestured at the chair opposite his desk with a motion that wasn't quite gracious but wasn't dismissive either. Harry sat. The office was cold, as always, the stone walls hung with pickled things in jars and the desk stacked with the infrastructure of a man who did 3 jobs simultaneously and had done so for over a decade. Spy, teacher, Dumbledore's instrument. Harry looked at the desk and thought about the weight of that, and found he could look at it without any of the old automated hostility, just the clear cool consideration of what a human life looked like when it had been thoroughly managed. Bones interviewed you yesterday, Harry said. She did, Snape said. I found her to be thorough. Did she tell you about your markers? In the specific terms Pomfrey's diagnostic identified them, yes. Snape's voice was very even. He'd had a day to sit with it and he'd done whatever Snape did with devastating emotional information, which apparently involved achieving a degree of composure that was frankly impressive. I have since reviewed the relevant diagnostic literature independently. The markers she described are consistent with a specific variant of loyalty compulsion that I have, in fact, encountered in the theoretical literature while researching related topics. You've been researching behavioral modification magic for 20 years, Harry said. To understand what was done to you. Snape looked at him for a long moment. Not precisely, he said. Initially I was looking at it from a different angle. He paused. Voldemort used compulsion magic extensively within the Death Eater ranks. I was attempting to understand the mechanism, partly to counter it, partly to understand my own, the nature of certain choices I had made under his influence and afterward. He stopped. You wanted to know how much was you, Harry said. Yes, Snape said, simply and finally, which was the most unguarded thing Harry had ever heard from him. Marchbanks can remove the markers, Harry said. Same process she used on me. It takes a couple of hours. I'm aware. Will you do it? Snape leaned back in his chair and looked at Harry with the expression of a man facing a question he has already answered privately but is reluctant to perform the answering of publicly, because performance is different from decision. I find myself in an unusual position, Potter, he said. I have spent the last 24 hours reviewing, in light of recent information, the architecture of the past 13 years. And I find that certain things I have attributed to my own judgment and conviction. He paused. Certain things are less cleanly mine than I believed. Some of them are still yours, Harry said. Probably most of them. The compulsion amplifies. It doesn't manufacture wholesale. So you told me yesterday. I'm saying it again because I mean it, Harry said. Whatever you genuinely chose, for your own reasons, that's still yours. The charms don't take that. They just, he looked for the right word. They slant the field. Tilt things in specific directions. Your reasons for opposing Voldemort. Whatever they were, genuinely, were Lily, Snape said quietly. The name sat in the cold office air. Harry looked at him steadily. And is that still true? Now that you know the full shape of what Dumbledore did with that. The silence lasted a long time. Yes, Snape said, and his voice was level with the effort of it. It is still true. She was a remarkable person, and she did not deserve what happened to her, and I will spend the rest of my life in consequence of having been instrumental in what happened to her. The charms don't alter that. If anything, he stopped. Started again. If anything, knowing that Dumbledore used my grief as a tool makes my reasons feel more mine, not less. Because the grief itself, that, he didn't create. Harry nodded once. "I'm going to ask you something," Harry said. "And I need an honest answer." Snape raised an eyebrow that said, "I will evaluate the question. Do you know the full content of the prophecy?" The eyebrow stayed up. "Then, yes. Does it require my death?" The pause before Snape answered was precisely 2 seconds long and was one of the most informative silences Harry had ever sat in. Dumbledore's interpretation of it, Snape said carefully, required you to survive long enough to serve a specific function and then, accept a specific outcome. Whether the prophecy itself requires it depends on how literally you read prophetic language, and how much agency you assign to. He stopped. "The answer to your question is that Dumbledore believed so." "I know," Harry said. "I've worked it out. The soul fragment, you know about it." Snape went very still. "I can see from your face that you do," Harry said. "What you may not know is that I found a way around it. A medical procedure. The fragment can be extracted and destroyed without the outcome Dumbledore was building toward." The stillness in Snape's face collapsed into something that was, very briefly, purely human and completely unguarded. He looked at Harry, 14 years old, sitting in his cold office without fear, without the anxious deference or the reactive resentment that had characterized every interaction between them for 4 years, and something moved through his expression that Harry could not fully categorize but recognized, instinctively, as enormous. "You found another way," Snape said. "I found another way," Harry confirmed. Snape looked at his desk. He looked at the wall. He looked back at Harry. "Then the question of whether to participate in whatever you're planning," he said slowly, "becomes considerably more interesting." "I'm not asking for your allegiance," Harry said clearly. "I'm not Dumbledore. I'm not building a network of people who owe me things. I'm giving you information and leaving the decisions to you. But I'll tell you what I am doing. I'm going to the Wizengamot session in 6 days, with Sirius, as Lord Potter, and I'm going to use the investigation evidence to begin formally dismantling 65 years of managed power. And after that, I'm going after Voldemort's anchors, systematically, before he comes back with a body, so that when the final confrontation happens, it happens on terms that don't require anyone's death except his." Snape looked at him for a very long time. "You are," he said, "extraordinarily like your mother." "I know," Harry said. "It's starting to feel like a compliment." Something moved in Snape's eyes that might have been, under several layers of control and self-management and a lifetime of choosing dignity over expression, something like a smile. "Have Marchbanks contact me about the procedure," Snape said. "I will. And Potter." Harry paused at the door. "The diadem. The lost diadem of Ravenclaw. If it is where you believe it is, in the room of requirement storage aspect, you should be aware that the magic in that room is unstable around significant dark objects. Take precautions before you enter with intent." Harry looked back at him. "Do you know it's there?" "I have suspected, for some time, that there is something significant in that room that the headmaster is deliberately not looking at," Snape said. "He has walked past that wall more than any person in this castle and has never, in my observation, made any move to investigate." He paused. "Which is itself instructive." "Yes," Harry said. "It is." He looked at Snape for a moment. "Thank you." He meant it, and Snape clearly recognized that he meant it, which appeared to be, by Snape's reaction, nearly as disconcerting as everything else about the day. Harry left. The 6 days before the Wizengamot session were the most productive of Harry's life. Hermione produced a 17-page legal brief on the Jenkins precedent and its applications, annotated with 14 case citations, which Bones received and immediately incorporated into her evidentiary structure. Ron, whose chess mind turned out to be devastatingly effective when applied to strategic planning, worked through the Wizengamot voting math with Sirius and identified 3 additional uncommitted members who had specific historical grievances against the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes that Dumbledore effectively controlled, grievances they could approach through proper channels. Marchbanks cleared Snape's markers on the 4th day. Harry wasn't there for it, because Snape had asked for privacy and privacy was the least Harry could offer a man facing that particular kind of interior earthquake. But Snape appeared at dinner that evening and sat at the staff table and ate his meal with an expression that was slightly different than it had been for 4 years, still controlled, still private, still Snape, but with the particular quality of a man who has been carrying a weight he was convinced was load-bearing and has discovered, with its removal, that the structure holds. He caught Harry's eye once across the great hall. Harry gave him a small nod. Snape returned it, once, with the precision of someone who is choosing to acknowledge something they would normally not acknowledge, and turned back to his meal. Dumbledore watched this exchange. He watched it from the center of the staff table with the expression of a man doing very fast and not entirely comfortable arithmetic, his lemon drop untouched beside his plate, his eyes moving between Snape and Harry with the specific quality of attention that very intelligent people gave to things that were developing in ways they hadn't predicted. Harry met his gaze across the hall, directly and without the automatic dropping of the eyes that 4 years of conditioning had made instinctive. He held it for 3 full seconds. Then he looked away, because Dumbledore's gaze was not the most important thing in the room and he had no interest in performing the opposite of deference when pure indifference was available. The night before the Wisengamot session, Harry went to the room of requirement. Alone. He'd told the others he was going to bed early. This wasn't entirely a lie, he would sleep, eventually, but there was something he needed to do alone first, because it needed to be done and it needed to be him, and involving others in the search of the storage room felt, for reasons he didn't fully examine, like something that should be kept small. The room opened for him on the third pass, a vast, cathedral-ceilinged space stuffed floor to height with the accumulated discarded debris of centuries. Furniture, books, broken instruments, shattered mirrors, taxidermied animals, a collection of chamber pots that had clearly seen better days. The dark had a specific character in here, layered and old. He took Snape's warning about unstable magic seriously and cast a broad diagnostic sweep before he moved more than 10 feet from the entrance. The diagnostic returned colors, mostly the ordinary blue of benign magical residue, a few amber warnings around particular objects, and in the distance, 50 yards in and to the left, a deep pulsing red-black that moved on the edge of perception like a bruise. Harry moved toward it carefully, casting shields as he went, proper ones, not the reflexive single-layer protection that anxiety and charm-suppressed thinking had made him default to. 3-layer, interlocked, the architecture he'd read about but somehow never consistently applied because doing it right required sustained concentration and a magical output that had, previously, been throttled. He felt the throttle's absence now as a constant background fact, like the hum of a machine running properly, power moving at the pace it was actually designed for. Spells that had always taken effort and focus came with a new ease that would require calibration, Marchbanks had warned, but which for now simply felt correct. Like the difference between running in chest-deep water and running on dry ground. The diadem was perched on the head of a statue of a warlock, partly hidden behind a broken vanity mirror and a tower of stacked crates. It looked exactly like what it was, a circlet of aged metal with an inscription that caught Harry's lumos, "Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure. Ravenclaw's lost diadem." Beautiful, and radiating the specific dark wrongness that Harry now associated, with sick precision, with Voldemort's presence. He didn't touch it. He stood 3 feet from it and looked at it and thought about a 17-year-old boy, brilliant and monstrous, slipping into Hogwarts under a false name to hide a piece of his soul in the school of his greatest triumph. He thought about the arrogance of it. The certainty. The belief that the world was a game you could win by simply placing your pieces correctly and never imagining that someone else might find them. He set a containment ward around the diadem, a specific one, for dark objects, using the technique he'd found in a 1903 theoretical text, and marked the location with a tracking charm, and left it there. It needed to be destroyed properly. He had basilisk venom. He had a plan. But tonight he stood in the room of requirement and looked at one of Tom Riddle's anchors and felt, settling into his bones, the clear and unambiguous conviction that this was winnable. Not easy. Not without cost. But winnable, on terms he chose, with people he'd chosen to trust, for reasons that were entirely his own. He walked back out. The corridor was empty except for a suit of armor that swiveled to watch him pass, which was either the castle's habitual nosiness or a spell, and Harry was too focused on tomorrow's logistics to investigate further. He went to his dormitory, where Ron was asleep in a sprawl that took up significantly more than his allocated bed space, and Neville's curtains were drawn, and Dean and Seamus were murmuring about Quidditch in voices that were losing coherence with each passing minute. Harry climbed into bed. He thought briefly about Dumbledore, sitting in his round office right now, working through his options for the morning session with the thoroughness of a man who had been navigating political crises for 6 decades. He thought about what it would feel like, the morning, the chamber, the gallery above, 50-odd people in purple robes watching 2 Lords Potter and Black arrive in seats that had been empty too long. He thought about his parents. Not with the amplified grief that had been his default for 14 years. With something cleaner, a clear, sad pride in the fact that they had tried and had been betrayed by someone they trusted, and that their son was here, doing what they couldn't, on behalf of everything they'd died for. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow the board moved. Tomorrow everyone would see exactly how many pieces Harry Potter had been quietly accumulating while Albus Dumbledore had been watching the boy he thought he'd built and seeing only what he designed. Harry slept, and in the morning he rose early, showered, and dressed in the best robes he owned, which were, because no one had ever thought to tell him that as Lord Potter he was entitled to a wardrobe allowance from the family vault, not particularly impressive, and then Sirius appeared at the portrait hole at 7:45 with a flat, rectangular case that he handed over without explanation. Harry opened it. Inside, on a bed of dark velvet, was a set of robes he had never seen before. Deep green, not Slytherin green, something older and more complex than that, with subtle silver and gold embroidery at the cuffs and collar. The Potter family crest at the breast pocket, detailed and precise. "They've been in the family vault since your grandfather's time," Sirius said. "They resize. And before you say anything about not wanting to be theatrical, I'm not going to say that," Harry said. Sirius blinked. "You're, really? Politics is partly theater," Harry said. "Showing up in formal Potter robes to claim a seat that's been empty since my parents died is exactly the kind of statement that has practical value. It's not about vanity. It's about being visible." Sirius looked at him for a long moment with the expression Harry was getting very familiar with. "Your mother," Sirius said, "was going to be Minister for Magic." Before, he stopped. She had this exact same grasp of how rooms work. Harry took the robes. He changed into them in his dormitory while Ron watched with an expression of combined awe and slight competitive resentment that resolved into genuine appreciation when Harry turned around, because the robes fit perfectly and the effect was, Harry could objectively observe, exactly the right kind of statement. "Blimey," said Ron. "Too much?" Harry asked. "No," Ron said. No. It's right. It looks right." They went down to breakfast. The hall did the thing it always did when something changed, the gradual ripple of attention, the murmur spreading outward. Harry walked to the Gryffindor table and sat and ate his toast and ignored it comprehensively, which was, he discovered, significantly more effective than either acknowledging it or reacting to it. Dumbledore looked at him from the staff table with the expression of a man reviewing his understanding of a chess game and realizing that several pieces had moved in the night. Harry looked back at him, and then at his toast, and thought about the Wizengamot chamber in the Ministry of Magic, and the 50 seats in it, and the 14 uncommitted votes, and the 5 that were his and Sirius's, and the specific precise devastating weight of irrefutable evidence in the hands of Amelia Bones. He thought, game on. He finished his toast. Chapter 5, The weight of what was built. The Wizengamot chamber sat beneath the Ministry of Magic like a held breath. Harry had been here once before, his hearing, 3rd year, which he'd spent in a chair that was too large for him with manacles that didn't close around his wrists because he was too small for those two, answering questions about a Patronus charm while Dumbledore sat in the Chief Warlock's seat and managed the proceedings with the practiced ease of a conductor who had been leading the same orchestra for decades. He'd left that hearing without a conviction and with the vague understanding that Dumbledore had arranged that outcome, which he'd been grateful for at the time. He walked in differently today. The chamber was larger than he remembered, a circular space with tiered seating that rose on all sides like an amphitheater, the visitor gallery running the upper ring, the 50 Wisengamot seats below arranged in their precise formation of purple robes and pointed hats. The ceiling was low and vaulted, the lighting the particular flat amber of a space that had been magically lit for centuries without ever quite successfully mimicking daylight. The acoustics were exceptional, as amphitheaters tend to be, which meant that the murmur that moved through the chamber when Harry and Sirius walked through the main doors at exactly 9:59 was clearly audible. Sirius wore black family robes, dark as his name, with silver constellation work at the borders that moved very slightly in the light, the stars repositioning themselves in slow increments. He walked with his shoulders back and his chin up in the contained purpose of a man who had spent 12 years in Azkaban and 7 months technically free and had been waiting a very long time for a room like this one. Harry walked beside him and didn't think about the chamber's history or the weight of the occasion or the eyes tracking their progress from the tiered seats. He thought about the next 20 minutes and what they needed to accomplish in them, which was a more productive use of attention. They reached the Potter seats. 2 chairs, positioned in the third tier of the chamber floor, bearing the Potter family crest on the back in carved stone. Unoccupied for 13 years. Slightly dusty in the way that ceremonial things got dusty when nobody was maintaining them because everyone had stopped expecting them to be used. Harry sat down. The murmur went up a register. Sirius took the black family seats, 3 chairs, adjacent tier, and the murmur went up another register, because Sirius Black appearing in the Wisengamot chamber was either a very significant political statement or the opening of a very significant problem, depending on which side of the aisle you were sitting on, and half the chamber was still working out which it was. Dumbledore was already in the Chief Warlock's seat at the head of the chamber. He was dressed in his most formal robes, deep blue, floor-length, the kind of formal that declared authority before a word was spoken. He looked at Harry across the chamber with an expression that Harry could now read clearly, having spent 6 days studying the architecture of the man's manipulation. This was Dumbledore containing a response. Controlling the framing of his own reaction in real time so that the response visible to the 50 pairs of eyes in the room was the right one. What Dumbledore showed the chamber was serene acknowledgement. What Harry saw underneath it, because he was looking for it and because his unthrottled mind processed exactly what it was looking at rather than what it had been shaped to see, was a man recalculating rapidly and not liking the results. Amelia Bones was seated in the investigative advocate's chair, a specific position in the chamber's structure, reserved for formal DMLE proceedings, placed at an angle that gave its occupant equal sight lines to the Chief Warlock and the full body of the Wisengamot. She had a stack of documents on the desk before her, organized with the precision of someone who had spent 5 days preparing this presentation and had no interest in being anything less than irrefutable. She caught Harry's eye briefly when he sat. A small nod. Acknowledgement that the pieces were in position. The session opened with procedural ceremony, the calling of the body to order, the formal acknowledgement of new seat holders, which produced another wave of murmuring when Harry's name was read aloud. The member conducting the roll, an elderly wizard named Tiberius Ogden whose spectacular eyebrows deserved their own ceremony, paused when he reached Potter, H.J., said the name with the careful neutrality of a man who was doing his job and not editorializing, and moved on. Then Bones stood. Chief Warlock, she said. Members of the Wisengamot. This body has received formal notification of a DMLE investigation opened under the Magical Persons Protection Act of 1947. I am here today to present preliminary findings and request the body's formal authorization for the next investigative phase. The floor recognizes Director Bones, Dumbledore said, pleasantly. She opened her file. What followed was 20 minutes of the most precisely devastating testimony Harry had ever witnessed, and he'd sat through some significant testimony in his 14 years. Bones presented the facts without editorializing, which was far more effective than editorializing would have been. The diagnostic findings. The number. The nature of the charms, categorized by type with their legal classifications under the 1947 Act and the subsequent 1979 amendments. The estimated placement dates, cross-referenced with documented events. The signature identification methodology, with the methodology's court-approved accuracy rating of 94%. She did not name Dumbledore. She did not need to. The signature in question was one of the most documented magical signatures in British wizarding history, 65 years of letters, publications, legal instruments, school communications, and ministry correspondence, all cross-referenceable. When Bones presented the signature and noted its identification against the documented record, the chamber arrived at the conclusion by itself, which was considerably more powerful than being told. Harry watched 50 people realize, in real time, what they were looking at. The murmur that went through the chamber then was different from the earlier murmurs. It had a quality of genuine shock, not disbelief, because many of these people had held private suspicions for years, but the specific shock of having a private suspicion become public evidence in a formal proceeding, which was an entirely different thing. Dumbledore's expression had not changed visibly. His hands, folded on the Chief Warlock's desk, were perfectly still. Cyrus Greengrass, 2 rows above Harry's position, leaned forward in his seat with an expression of sharp attention. Marcus Abbott had gone pale. Several of the uncommitted block members were exchanging glances with the specific careful quality of people who wanted to communicate something without being caught communicating it. "Director Bones," said a voice from the left tier, Dolores Umbridge, pink and fixed smiling in her ministry senior undersecretary seat, which was technically an observer position but which she had apparently decided entitled her to speak. "Surely you're not suggesting that the Chief Warlock, I'm presenting findings," Bones said, without looking at her. "The body may draw its own conclusions." "But to imply, the body," Bones said, with a finality that ended the sentence and the interruption simultaneously, "may draw its own conclusions." Umbridge subsided. She did not look happy about it. Dumbledore raised his hand. His voice, when he spoke, was what it always was, warm, measured, carrying the authority of a man who was entirely comfortable speaking in rooms like this because he had been speaking in rooms like this for longer than most of the people in them had been alive. "The chair would like to note," he said, "that the investigation Director Bones is pursuing is complex and that certain diagnostic findings are subject to interpretive variation. The chair would further like to note that any magical modifications identified in connection with Mr. Potter's early childhood may be connected to the protective enchantments placed by his late mother, Lily Potter, at the time of her death, enchantments which were, by their nature, uniquely powerful and structurally unusual." A pause. Calculated. He let it breathe. "The chair would recommend patience," Dumbledore continued, "as this investigation proceeds. And would remind the body that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence before formal action can be considered." It was good. Harry had to acknowledge that it was good. The deflection to Lily's protective magic was precisely the kind of move that was difficult to immediately counter because it required technical expertise to rebut, was emotionally resonant because it invoked a dead woman's sacrifice, and had the additional advantage of being partially true. Lily's magic was real and was exceptional and was genuinely a complicating factor in the diagnostic picture. Harry stood up. He didn't ask for the floor. He stood up, and the chamber's attention snapped to him the way attention snapped to things that weren't supposed to happen. "Lord Potter," Ogden said, his eyebrows doing something expressive, "you are recognized." "Thank you," Harry said. "I have a technical question for Director Bones." He looked at Bones. "The protective magic placed by my mother at the time of her death, is its signature documented?" Bones, who had apparently anticipated this, reached for a specific document in her file. Lily Potter's magical signature was registered with the Ministry at time of her Order of the Phoenix membership and is documented in the Magical Registry. "Yes." "And is her signature present in the diagnostic markers identified in the report?" "It is not," Bones said. "Lily Potter's signature is present in the scar and in the ambient magical architecture of certain protective enchantments operating around Mr. Potter's person. It is not present in any of the 107 behavioral modification markers identified." Silence. "Thank you," Harry said, and sat down. The deflection was dead. Dumbledore had used it and it had lasted approximately 45 seconds before being dismantled with 2 questions, and every person in the chamber had watched it happen. Dumbledore looked at Harry across the chamber. Harry looked back. Whatever the look contained on Dumbledore's side, and Harry thought there were several things in it, layered and complicated, the look of a man seeing something he'd built replaced by something he hadn't anticipated. It was not the look he'd been giving Harry for 4 years. The paternal warmth was still there, but it was thinner, and underneath it something more honest was visible. Recognition, Harry thought again. The same recognition he'd seen in the hospital wing corridor. Not defeat. Not yet. But the beginning of understanding that the parameters of this game had fundamentally changed. Cyrus Greengrass stood next. He was a tall, angular man in his 50s with the careful grooming of someone who took tradition seriously and the sharp eyes of someone who took everything else more seriously. "I would like to propose," he said, with the smooth ease of a man who had been preparing this motion, "a vote on the temporary suspension of the Chief Warlock's procedural authority pending the completion of the DMLE investigation. On the basis that the subject of the investigation holding such authority during its conduct presents an unresolvable conflict of interest. The Jenkins precedent, cited perfectly." Dumbledore's hands moved for the first time. Not much, a small adjustment, the fingers separating and resettling, but Harry caught it. "Second," said Marcus Abbott immediately. "Third," said a voice Harry didn't recognize from the upper tiers, which was one of the uncommitted block members and constituted a very significant development because 3 seconds gave the vote immediate procedural standing. "A vote is proposed," Ogden said. "The body will prepare." "The chair would," Dumbledore began. "The chair," Ogden said, with the special quality of a very old man who had run out of patience with a very long situation, "is recused from this vote by the terms of the Jenkins ruling, which I am certain the Chief Warlock is familiar with." A pause. "Of course," Dumbledore said pleasantly. The vote happened. Harry watched it, the raised wands, the count, the counter-count, Ogden tallying with the focused attention of a man who had conducted more votes than most people had eaten breakfasts and was not going to get this one wrong. The chamber divided roughly as the math had suggested, Dumbledore's block of 23 solid against, the Greengrass and Abbott votes plus Harry's 2 and Sirius's 3 in favor, and then, the 14 uncommitted members, who split 8 to 6, the 8 for suspension and 6 for maintenance. 32 to 18. The vote carried. In the gallery above, Harry heard a sound that was the crowd absorbing the result, and it moved through the room the way sound moved in that vaulted space, cleanly, with nowhere to go but everywhere. Ogden said, "The motion carries. Chief Warlock Dumbledore's procedural authority is suspended pending the conclusion of the DMLE investigation. The Deputy Chief Warlock will chair proceedings during this period." Dumbledore rose from the Chief Warlock's seat. He did it with complete dignity. No argument, no visible reaction. He walked to the chamber floor and took a regular member's seat with the composure of a man who had been navigating political realities for 65 years and was not going to be seen to be destabilized by any single one of them. But he was no longer in the chair. Harry looked at that empty chair for a moment and felt something that was not triumph, too complicated for triumph, but was in the same general territory as resolution. The session continued for another 2 hours, covering other business with the slightly distracted quality of a group of people attempting to function normally after a significant earthquake. Harry sat through it and took notes and identified 3 further procedural tools he intended to use at the next session, and when it was over and the chamber began to empty he stayed in his seat while the purple robes filed out and watched Dumbledore navigate the departing crowd. He was mobbed. Not unpleasantly. It was a mob of concerned supporters rather than critics, people pulling him aside for quiet conversation, pressing his arm, looking at him with the specific anxious loyalty of people who had organized their understanding of the world around this man for decades and were not sure what to do with a world that was reorganizing itself around something else. Dumbledore moved through them with grace and warmth and the same expression he always wore, and if the warmth was now slightly more effortful than usual, it was not detectable to someone who didn't know what they were looking for. Harry knew what he was looking for. Sirius appeared at his elbow. 32-18, he said quietly. Better than I expected, Harry said. 6 more than we needed. He paused. Greengrass was good. He was. Make sure he knows we noticed. Harry stood. We need to move on the locket. Mundungus Fletcher, do you have a way to find him? Mundungus can always be found, Sirius said. He's predictable in the way that people without real ambition tend to be. He'll be at the Hog's Head, or Nocturne Alley, or somewhere in between. I'll put Lupin on it. Remus has a particular talent for finding things that would prefer not to be found. Lupin is. Harry paused. Is he available? I haven't. He'd like to see you, Sirius said. He's been. When I told him, last night by flu, he didn't say much. Remus doesn't, when things hit him hard. But he'd like to see you. Harry nodded. Arrange it. The 3 of us. They left the chamber together and Harry looked back once at the room, the empty Chief Warlock's chair, the curved tiers of seats, the gallery above, and then forward at the corridor and what came next. 2 days later, the locket was found. Mundungus Fletcher, confronted by Sirius Black and Remus Lupin in an alley off Nocturne at 11 in the morning, produced the locket from a bag of stolen goods with the speed of a man who had suddenly recalled several outstanding warrants and was recalculating the wisdom of being difficult. He didn't know what it was, he'd taken it because it was heavy and old and looked expensive and had refused to open, which he'd attributed to a lock charm. He handed it over with the specific gratitude of someone receiving unexpected mercy and disappeared in the direction of somewhere less legally complicated. The locket went into a containment case identical to the one Harry had used in the room of requirement. Sirius held the case and looked at his family crest on the front of it, the black family seal, pressed into the wax around the containment ward, and his expression was doing the thing Harry had seen in the Chamber of Secrets with Regulus's name, the complicated grief of a man cataloguing the costs of a war that had been running longer than he'd thought. He found it, Sirius said. Regulus. He found out what it was and went back to get it. He went back to that cave, he stopped. He did, Harry said. He was 20 years old, Sirius said quietly. They stood in the alley and let that be what it was for a moment. Then Sirius squared his shoulders and picked up the case and they went back to the safe house Bones had arranged for them near the ministry. The cup was the next problem. Gringotts was not a building that admitted to having problems, but the problem existed regardless, a Horcrux in Bellatrix Lestrange's vault, locked behind the bank's considerable security apparatus, accessible legally only by the vault's owner, who was currently in Azkaban. Harry sat with Hermione and Ron and a very detailed map of Gringotts' publicly known security structure, sourced from a Goblin Relations text Hermione had found in the library, and they spent an afternoon working through it. The thing about Gringotts, Hermione said, tapping the map, is that their security is designed to repel outsiders. It's not designed to account for institutional cooperation. If Bones formally requisitions the contents of the vault as part of a criminal evidence-gathering process under the war crimes provisions of the 1945 Magical Conflicts Act, can she do that? Ron asked. She's the head of the DMLE and Bellatrix Lestrange is a convicted Death Eater currently incarcerated under a life sentence, Hermione said. Yes, she can absolutely do that. The question is whether Gringotts cooperates, which depends on the formal diplomatic relationship between the Ministry and the Goblin Nation. Which Dumbledore has historically managed, Harry said. Right, Hermione said. Which means it's possible that the Goblins are operating under certain agreements that would make them resistant to a Ministry request. She paused. But the Goblins' relationship with Dumbledore is transactional, not loyalty-based. They don't trust humans on principle. If we offer them something they want more than they want to maintain a complicated arrangement with a man who is currently under investigation, what do they want? Ron asked. Harry was already thinking about it. There's a standing dispute over the Return of Historical Artifacts Act, the Goblins have been trying to renegotiate it since 1968. The original terms gave wizards ownership of Goblin-made objects sold to them, which the Goblins have always argued misrepresents the Goblin understanding of the original sale. He looked at Hermione. What's the Lord Potter family's position on the historical artifacts legislation? Hermione stared at him. How do you know about that? I spent an afternoon in the library, Harry said simply. The Potter family voted against the original act in 1968, Hermione said slowly, clearly pulling it from memory. Your grandfather opposed it. He was overruled by the majority bloc. She paused. Which Dumbledore was part of. So if Lord Potter, Harry said, were to formally notify the Goblin Nation's representatives that he intends to sponsor a renegotiation of the Historical Artifacts Act when he has sufficient Wisengamot standing, they'd cooperate on the vault search, Sirius said from the doorway, where he'd appeared at some point in the last 5 minutes. Merlin. You've been doing political theory. I've been doing problem solving, Harry said. The vault is a problem. The goblins are a resource with a specific interest. It's not complicated. It's extremely complicated, Sirius said. You're just processing it differently than most people. Harry sent a formal letter to the director of Gringotts that afternoon, signed with the Potter family seal, outlining his position on the historical artifacts legislation and requesting a meeting. The response arrived the next morning, an acceptance, in the clipped formal prose of goblin diplomacy, and a meeting time for the following week. He was still reading it when the knock came. Not on the door of the safe house, on the specific window that Snape had designated for emergency communication, a charm-based signal that produced a sound like a thrown pebble against glass. Harry went to the window. A small folded note, spelled to hover. He opened it. He made a move. 3 parents of Muggleborn students have received visits from ministry representatives this afternoon citing unspecified welfare concerns regarding their children's enrollment. The pattern matches a precedent from 1982. You'll know what to do with this. Harry read it twice. Then he went to find Bones. She was in her temporary office at the ministry, a space she'd commandeered from a department that had been given no choice about the arrangement, and she was already reading when Harry arrived, which told him the note to Snape hadn't been the only line of communication carrying this information. He's going after the Muggleborns, Harry said. I'm aware. Her voice was the flat kind of calm that came from controlled fury. The 1982 precedent is the Andromeda Regulation, a piece of ministry guidance that was never formally legislated but that certain senior ministry officials have used to apply quiet pressure to Muggleborn families. Suggesting, informally, that their children's enrollment at Hogwarts may not be in the family's best interest. Suggesting that perhaps alternative arrangements, Hermione, Harry said. And others. It's a pressure tool, Bones said. It's designed to create noise. To distract you from the Wisengamot work by giving you something closer to home to react to. She looked at him directly. Which means the correct response is to not react to it the way he expects. He expects you to prioritize the immediate emotional threat. Harry thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. Publish it, he said. Bones raised an eyebrow. Every detail of the visits. Every family contacted. Every ministry representative who conducted them. Publish it through the Quibbler. Bones, do you have a relationship with Xenophilius Lovegood? Tangentially, she said. The prophet is Dumbledore adjacent, but the Quibbler has been sitting on a circulation problem for years and would benefit enormously from a genuine exclusive with the DMLE investigative lead, Harry said. Give them the story. All of it. The visits, the precedent, the implications. Make the intimidation of Muggleborn families part of the documented pattern of behavior under investigation. He paused. It stops the tactic immediately because daylight kills it. And it adds another piece to the public record. Bones looked at him for a moment with the expression she occasionally produced when Harry did something that adjusted her calibration of what 14-year-olds were capable of. I'll contact Lovegood this evening, she said. Good. Harry turned toward the door. Potter. He stopped. He's going to escalate, she said. When the Quibbler publishes, when the Goblin meeting goes ahead, when the next Wisengamot session approaches, he's going to do something larger. Something you may not have anticipated. I want you to be prepared for that. I know, Harry said. He still has a plan. He's been running it for 65 years and he's not going to abandon it entirely just because some of the pieces have moved. He met her eyes. He still thinks Voldemort is coming back. He still thinks the prophecy is the blueprint. He's probably recalculating whether he can salvage the outcome he planned, the necessary death, the resurrection, the defeat, using whatever pieces are still in position. The tournament, Bones said. Yes. Harry had been thinking about the tournament constantly, a background thread running parallel to everything else. Someone put my name in the goblet. That person is still here, in this castle, working a plan. Voldemort's plan, filtered through Dumbledore's plan, and neither of them intersects in a way that has any version of good for me. He paused. I need to know who it is. And I need to know before the second task. I have Aurors at the school, Bones said. Proudfoot and 2 others. They've been watching. I know, Harry said. I've noticed Proudfoot is very good at not being noticed, which is the correct qualification for the job. He turned back to the door. I'm going back to Hogwarts tonight. I have research to do before the weekend. He went back. The school received him the way it always did, familiar, old, smelling of stone and history and the complicated warmth of a building that had housed children for 1,000 years, and Harry walked through it and noticed, as he had been noticing since the charms were lifted, that his relationship to this place was different now. Not colder. More honest. Hogwarts was complicated, it was a place that had given him the first version of belonging he'd ever known, and it was also a place that had been used as part of the apparatus of his management. Both things were true and he was capable of holding both. He went to the room of requirement. Not the storage aspect this time, the working room, the one that became what you needed. He needed a research space, and the room provided one, a large table, bookshelves filled with texts that seemed to have materialized from the castle's own considerable library, good light and a fire. He sat and spread his notes in front of him and began to work. The problem he was working on was the prophecy itself. He'd been circling it for days, the content of it, the structure, the interpretive possibilities, and he kept arriving at the same place. The prophecy said, as best he'd reconstructed it from various sources, neither can live while the other survives. Which was cryptic in the specific way that seers were cryptic, technically precise and deliberately unanchored. It didn't say Harry had to die. It didn't specify mechanism or timeline or method. It said that 2 specific people could not simultaneously survive. Which meant one of 2 things, either Voldemort had to die without Harry dying, which required eliminating all the Horcruxes first, which Harry was actively doing, and then a direct confrontation, which was a manageable problem. Or it meant something more structural about the magical connection between them, the shared blood, the scar, the fragment, that required a more surgical solution. He thought about the magical core connection. The soul fragment and the scar. Marchbanks had said the soul fragment could be extracted. But the connection itself, the Parseltongue, the occasional emotional leakage, the pain response to Voldemort's presence, that was structural. Born in the moment the curse rebounded. He pulled a specific text toward him, a 1731 treatise on magical rebounding phenomena, arcane and rarely read, which he'd found through a cross-reference chain in the restricted section. The section on killing curse rebound was 3 pages long and written in the dense prose of an era that believed thoroughness and accessibility were mutually exclusive, but Harry read it carefully and found, buried in the 3rd page, a sentence that made him stop. When a rebounded killing curse produces a survivor, the magical connection between the original caster and the survivor constitutes a living tether, not unlike the connection between a Horcrux and its creator, and is sustained by the survival of both parties. The destruction of either party severs the tether absolutely. He read it again. Then he read the next sentence. The tether may also be severed by the destruction of the caster's anchors prior to the casting of a new killing curse, at which point the tether, lacking the caster's distributed soul architecture to sustain it, collapses. Harry set the book down. sat very still. If Voldemort's Horcruxes were all destroyed before any further confrontation, no anchors, no distributed soul structure, then the tether that had existed since Halloween 1981 would have no supporting architecture. It would collapse. Without the tether, the soul fragment in Harry's scar would be inert, no longer sustained by the active connection, no longer fed by Voldemort's living presence. Marchbanks's procedure would work cleanly and completely, removing an inert fragment from a severed connection rather than an active one. It was the right order of operations. Destroy the Horcruxes. Sever the tether. Remove the fragment. Then the confrontation, with no necessary death on Harry's side, and with Voldemort mortal for the first time in decades. He sat with this for a long time. The fire crackled. The room of requirement was very quiet. He thought about Dumbledore, who had read the same texts, who had certainly read this text, because Dumbledore had read everything, and who had arrived at a different plan. A plan involving Harry's death as an operative component, not as a necessary consequence of other failures but as a deliberate mechanism. He thought about the guilt matrix and the grief amplifier and the instinct suppressor and understood, now, precisely what they were for. They were for the moment when Dumbledore sat Harry down and explained that he had to walk into the forest and let Voldemort kill him. The charms were the engineering that would make Harry accept that explanation. Without them, Harry had read a 3-page academic treatise and found the alternative. He thought, 65 years of planning, and he missed a footnote. He gathered his notes. He stood. He looked around the room that had given him what he needed, the way it always had when the need was genuine. "Thank you," he said to the room. It was probably unnecessary but it felt right, and without a charm telling him what felt right was a waste of energy, he was finding that it was worth doing things that simply felt right. He went to find Hermione and Ron. They were in the common room, which was mostly empty at this hour, and Hermione had 6 books open in a configuration that would have required 3 extra laps if she tried it at an ordinary table, which the room of requirement table had accommodated with characteristic efficiency on previous occasions and which the common room table was struggling with. Ron was playing chess against himself, which he did when his mind was working through something, moving pieces, and then switching sides with the focused automaticity of someone who found thinking easier with his hands occupied. Harry sat down between them and laid the transcript of the relevant prophecy section, his best reconstruction, with source citations, and the relevant page of the 1731 treatise in front of them both. Hermione read it in the time it took Ron to make 2 chess moves. "The Horcruxes first," she said. "All of them?" "Yes," Harry said. "Exactly that order. Cup next, the Gringotts meeting is Tuesday. Then the diadem, which I've already located." "That's 5, Ron said, without looking up from the chessboard. "Diary, ring, locket, cup, diadem." 6, Harry said. "Nagini." "The snake," Ron said. He looked up now. "You have to get close enough to a giant magical serpent to kill it." "I speak Parseltongue," Harry said. "Getting close isn't the problem. The killing it part, basilisk venom," Harry said. "We have it in the files." A Parselmouth speaking a command in Parseltongue carries significantly higher authority over serpents than a spoken spell. "I can command her to hold still long enough for," he stopped. "I'll figure out the specific mechanism. The principle is sound." Ron looked at him for a moment. "The thing is," he said, "you say things like that and somehow it's not alarming anymore. That's either growth or normalization and I can't decide which." Harry almost laughed. "Probably both." "What about the 7th? Hermione asked. She was looking at him steadily. "You said 7 anchors. 6 objects. 1 more. Voldemort himself," Harry said. "The piece of soul he's retained. Which isn't an object to hunt, it's the endgame." She nodded slowly. "And your scar becomes irrelevant when the tether collapses," Harry said. "And Marchbanks removes the inert fragment. Which she said takes 2 weeks of preparation from whenever we're ready." He looked at them both. Which means we have a timeline. Destroy the remaining Horcruxes, realistically, 6 to 8 weeks given the Gringotts' coordination, prepare for the fragment removal, and then Voldemort comes back, Ron said quietly. Yes, Harry said. He's going to come back regardless. The tournament plan is already in motion. The second task is in February, the third in June, and whatever trap is set for the third task, that's when it happens. He paused. The question is whether it happens to a Voldemort who is mortal and anchorless and facing someone who has his full power and a plan, or to the version of those events that was designed by the people running their own agenda. And Dumbledore? Hermione asked. Harry thought about this. Dumbledore is a separate problem. A necessary one. But separate. He paused. He can't be dealt with the same way as Voldemort. He's not a Dark Lord. He's a man who did something terrible because he was certain it was right, and who has been justifying it to himself for 65 years, and who has done enormous amounts of genuine good alongside the harm. That requires, he looked for the word. Justice, Hermione said quietly. Not revenge. Justice. Yes. Harry met her eyes. Which is why Bones's investigation and the Wisengamot process matter. Because the answer to institutional corruption isn't to burn the institution. It's to hold it to its own standards. He paused. I want him to face what he did. Formally. In front of the body he's led. I want the record to say that this happened and that it was wrong and that someone was accountable. He looked at the fire. And then, after that, I don't know. That's not my decision to make. It's the Wisengamots. Ron moved a chess piece. Looked at it. Moved the opposing piece. The person who put your name in the goblet, he said. Moody. Harry and Hermione both looked at him. It's Moody, Ron said. He didn't sound uncertain. He sounded like someone who had been working through a chess problem and had just found the line. He was the one who encouraged you most loudly to act like a proper champion. He's been giving you specific advice. All year. Advice that would have, without everything that's changed, probably moved you toward exactly where you'd need to be in June for the trap to work. He paused. And there's something wrong with his eye. Not wrong like a magical eye is wrong like it's been slightly miscalibrated recently. And his flasks. He drinks from that flask constantly, but the flask is a custom enchanted item and I've been watching and the enchantment isn't a freshness charm, it's a polyjuice sustainer, Harry said. Ron pointed a chess piece at him. Yeah. Harry sat with this. Moody is someone else in a polyjuice disguise. He thought through the implications. Which means the real Moody is, somewhere, Ron said. Being kept alive to sample from, probably. Since polyjuice needs the original. Bones, Harry said, standing. We need Bones. Tonight. It's 10:30, Hermione said. She said to contact her immediately with anything that could identify the person who put my name in the goblet, Harry said. I think this qualifies. He was already moving. Ron, that was extraordinary. How long have you been? About a week, Ron said. I kept second-guessing myself because who looks at Alastair Moody and thinks polyjuice, but, he shrugged. It was the chess thing. He advises people the way a player would who already knows the board because he's designed it. Harry stopped at the portrait hole. You've been doing this for a week and you didn't say anything? Ron had the grace to look slightly sheepish. I wanted to be sure. Also I might have had a small residual thing about saying something smart and having it dismissed. He paused. Which is, I realize now, probably also something that was being managed, so. Harry looked at his best friend, red-haired, chess-talented, emotionally direct, sharper than anyone ever credited, and felt the loyalty charm's earlier ghost quite distinctly, because what he felt for Ron was entirely, obviously, straightforwardly real. Come with me, Harry said. Tell Bones yourself. Ron stood up from the chessboard. He left the pieces mid-game, white king in check, black knight on a dangerous diagonal, and followed Harry out of the portrait hole, and Hermione came behind him with one of the books tucked under her arm because she was constitutionally incapable of approaching a meeting with evidence without having at least one book she might reference. They went through the castle quickly, and the castle moved with them the way it moved with Harry, the staircases cooperative, the corridors clear, the night air between them and the Auror station Bones had established in a ground-floor room carrying the specific October cold that Harry had stopped finding miserable sometime in the last week and had started finding clarifying. He thought, as he walked, about the board and the pieces. The locket, contained. The diadem, located. The cup, in motion. The real Moody, to be found. The impostor, to be exposed. Voldemort's return, coming regardless, now to be met on different terms. Dumbledore's structure, cracking in real time. And himself, 14 years old, moving through a castle at 11 p.m. with his two best friends, carrying 6 weeks' worth of plans in his head and the first functional freedom of his life in his chest, feeling, underneath all the complexity and all the stakes and all the things that still needed doing, something he recognized belatedly as straightforwardly, uncomplicated, unremarkably fine. Not at peace with everything. Not unafraid of what was coming. Just fine. Present. Capable. Himself. Proudfoot answered Bones's door and looked at the three of them with the expression of a very competent Auror looking at teenagers who had arrived at 11 p.m. with the expressions of people carrying important information. Director Bones, Proudfoot said, over her shoulder, without moving her eyes from them. You're going to want to hear this. Bones appeared in the doorway, took one look at their faces, and stepped back to let them in. Tell me, she said. Ron told her. Chapter 6, The Reckoning. They found the real Alastor Moody in a trunk. Proudfoot and two senior Aurors swept Professor Moody's office at 2 a.m. with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before and preferred doing it when the subject was asleep. The trunk was under the bed, 7 locks, each one a different mechanism, and when the 7th came open the smell hit the corridor and the Auror nearest the door stepped back involuntarily. Moody was alive. Barely. He'd been kept at the minimum viable threshold, fed by spell, sedated, sampled every few days. He was conscious enough, when the sedation charm was lifted, to say 2 words before Pomfrey arrived with the medical team. Bones had all summoned the moment Ron finished talking. The 2 words were, Bartemius Crouch. Bartemius Crouch Jr., officially dead, sentenced to Azkaban at 17 for the torture of the Longbottoms, reported deceased in custody in 1982. His mother had taken Polyjuice on her deathbed and swapped places with him, and his father, Bartemius Crouch Sr., who had led the Death Eater prosecutions with the particular zeal of a man who needed no one to suspect him, had kept his son under the Imperius curse in his own home for a decade. Until recently, apparently, when the son had broken free. The impersonator, Crouch Jr., once the Polyjuice wore off in custody and left him looking like a thin pale scarecrow of a man with wild eyes and a dark mark on his forearm, was contained in the ministry holding cells by 4 a.m. Bones conducted the Veritaserum interview herself, Harry's presence permitted at her discretion, Sirius standing behind Harry's chair like a well-dressed threat. Crouch Jr. talked with the cheerful volubility of someone who had spent 10 years silenced and was delighted to finally have an audience. The plan was exactly what Harry had worked out, and worse than he'd expected, and also exactly on schedule. The goblet had been imperious to act as a binding magical contract. The tournament tasks were engineered to Harry's participation at every stage. The third task's maze would contain a portkey at its center, disguised as the Triwizard Cup. It would take Harry to a graveyard in Little Hangleton where Voldemort's rudimentary body was already waiting, and a ritual, bone of the father, flesh of the servant, blood of the enemy, would restore him to full form. The blood of the enemy part was Harry. When? Bones said. June 24th, Crouch Jr. said pleasantly. The third task. All very elegant, really. The master planned it down to the minute. He always did. Such a beautiful planner. The portkey location, Bones said. Little Hangleton graveyard. The Riddle grave specifically. Very theatrical. He does love theater. Harry looked at the man across the table, pale, hollow, the remnants of a person who had been used so thoroughly for so long that the original person was difficult to locate underneath the use, and felt something that was not pity exactly but was adjacent to it. Crouch Jr. had been monstrous. He was also a person who had been shaped, like Harry, by forces larger than himself, though the shaping had moved in a very different direction. He felt something about that which he didn't have a clean word for and didn't try to force into one. Location confirmed, Bones said quietly. We'll secure the site. She looked at Harry. Harry gave her a small nod. The plan was adjusting itself in real time, pieces sliding into new positions. The third task was still months away. The timeline for the Horcruxes was still on track. What had changed was that the trap was now known, which meant it was no longer a trap. An exposed trap was just a location. He went back to Hogwarts as the sky was beginning its slow lightening from black to a deep eastern blue, and he slept for 4 hours and woke without an alarm with the particular clarity of someone whose body had decided 4 hours was sufficient, and dressed, and went down to breakfast. Moody was absent from the staff table. Dumbledore was present. He had received no formal notification, Bones was not yet required to loop him in on active investigative developments, and had chosen not to, but he was observant enough to read the absent seat and the slight increase in visible ministry presence around the castle grounds and the fact that Harry had returned from whatever had called him away at 2 in the morning with a different quality to his stillness than he'd had before. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table and ate scrambled eggs and watched Dumbledore across the hall, and Dumbledore watched him back, and the distance between them had a quality that was completely unlike any distance that had existed between them before. No warmth on Harry's side that was manufactured. No deference. No instinct to look away or soften the directness of his regard. Just two people who understood each other's positions very clearly, separated by a room and 65 years of choices. Dumbledore looked, for the first time, like something was costing him. Good, Harry thought, and had some more eggs. The weeks moved. Gringotts on Tuesday produced a meeting that Harry approached with the appropriate formality, formal Potter robes, the family seal on his letters, Sirius present as Lord Black, which gave the meeting double the ancient house weight. The Goblin Director, a senior figure named Ragnarok who had the specific 1,000-yard stare of someone who had watched wizards waste his time for 3 centuries, received them with the measured courtesy of someone who had read the letter and found it interesting. Harry laid out his position on the historical artifacts legislation. He laid it out precisely, acknowledging the legitimate Goblin grievance, acknowledging the specific role of the 1968 Wiesengemot vote in entrenching an unjust precedent, and committing formally to sponsor a renegotiation as soon as he had sufficient block standing to make it viable. He did not make promises he couldn't keep. He said what he could do and when, and left room for Ragnarok to respond to the honesty of the terms rather than the performance of the offer. Ragnarok was quiet for a long moment. The vault will be made available to Director Bones's team on Thursday, he said. Full cooperation under the 1945 provisions. He paused. And Lord Potter? Yes. Your grandfather voted correctly in 1968. Ragnarok's expression didn't change. We noticed. The cup was in Bones's custody by Friday. Harry destroyed it himself, in a secure room at the ministry that Bones had arranged with ward work that would contain the outburst. He used a basilisk fong from Marchbanks's collection. She'd brought 3, sealed in individual stasis, with tongs and a full containment protocol, and the cup screamed when the fong went through it, a sound that moved through the walls and came back from the ceiling and then stopped with the particular abruptness of something that had been sustaining a sound for 50 years and had just run out of the thing that was sustaining it. Dark magic left the room like smoke from an opened window. 3 down, Harry said. 3 active. Sirius was sitting against the wall across from him. He'd insisted on being present for every destruction, which Harry had not argued with because it mattered to Sirius to see it happen and that was a sufficient reason. The diadem, Sirius said. Next weekend, Harry said. I want Hermione and Ron there. And Marchbanks for the containment afterward. He paused. And Snape. Sirius blinked. Snape. He knows that room better than anyone who hasn't spent time hiding things in it, Harry said. And he'll be useful for the magical stabilization. He's better at that specific discipline than any of the rest of us by a margin that's not worth pretending doesn't exist. Sirius made the face he sometimes made when acknowledging something accurate that he found distasteful. Fine, he said. How are you two, actually? Harry asked. You and Snape. Civil, Sirius said. Adjacent to not wanting each other dead. It's a process. He paused. He came to me. After Marchbanks cleared his markers. It was a brief conversation. He said things were more complicated than he'd understood and that certain historical positions might benefit from review. That's very Snape, Harry said. For an apology. It was the most elaborate non-apology I've ever received, Sirius said. And I've received a lot, because I have historically attracted people who owe me apologies. He was quiet for a moment. I told him about Regulus. What we found. That Regulus had tried. How did he take it? Quietly, Sirius said. Which is, I think, how Snape takes everything that actually matters to him. He looked at the destroyed cup. He said Lily would have been proud of Regulus. Which was, he stopped. Oddly the right thing. Harry said nothing and let it be what it was. The Wisingamot met again in November. Dumbledore had spent the month doing what Harry had expected him to do, working his block, writing letters, making the rounds of his supporters with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that political capital had to be actively maintained. The resulting session was harder than the first. His block had consolidated slightly, two of the uncommitted members having moved back into the Dumbledore column under pressure Harry suspected involved a combination of social leverage and the kind of quiet implication that a very connected man could deploy without leaving fingerprints. Harry had expected this. He'd also spent the month with Hermione's legal brief, Sirius's contacts, the Goblin cooperation visibly established in the public record, and the Crouch Jr. interview, formally published by DMLE as required under the transparency provisions of the 1947 Act, which meant the full content of Crouch's plan, including the names of all parties involved and the mechanism of the fake Moody's appointment to Hogwarts, was now a public document. The session opened with a motion to formally request Dumbledore's response to specific items in the DMLE investigative file under oath. The response to that motion, across the chamber, was 31-19. Which was lower than before. The consolidation had done its work, but was still, narrowly, sufficient. Dumbledore took the oath with the grace of a man who understood that refusing the oath would be worse than taking it. He stood at the advocate's position with his hands clasped behind his back and answered questions for 2 hours with the masterful performance of a person who could tell the technical truth and construct a deeply misleading picture simultaneously. He had placed magical modifications on Harry Potter. Yes. He characterized them as protective, as stabilizing, as necessary components of the enchantment structure related to Lily Potter's sacrifice. Had any of them been behavioral in nature? He was aware that diagnostic findings had characterized them in such terms. He had a different characterization. Were any of them placed without the consent of Harry's guardians? The Dursleys were Harry's guardians. He had, a pause, made certain decisions about Harry's upbringing that the Dursleys had been broadly aware of. Had the Dursleys consented to magical modification of their nephew? Consent was a complex notion in circumstances where the full magical context, yes or no, Bones said. The pause this time was longer. They were not consulted on specific magical interventions, Dumbledore said. The gallery murmured. It went on this way for 2 hours, Bones asking precise questions, Dumbledore constructing precise answers that confirmed facts while denying implications, and the chamber watching both with the specific absorption of people who understood they were seeing something historical happening in front of them. At the end of the 2 hours, nothing had collapsed. No confession had been extracted. No dramatic breaking point had occurred. But the record existed. Under oath. Every confirmation, every careful wording, every extended pause, all of it in the formal Wiesengemot transcript that would be available to every member, every journalist, every historian. Harry had never expected a 2-hour session to end Albus Dumbledore. He'd expected it to be one more piece of the structure. The diadem went on a Saturday afternoon in mid-November. The 5 of them went into the room of requirement storage aspect together, Harry, Hermione, Ron, Sirius, and Snape, who moved through the centuries of accumulated junk with the careful step of someone who knew the specific instability of objects stored in proximity to dark magic and was not interested in discovering it experimentally. Harry navigated to the diadem by the containment ward he'd set, which glowed steadily ahead of them in the dim space. Snape cast the magical stabilization as they approached, a complex, layered working that Harry watched with genuine admiration, Snape's wand moving in tight precise arcs while he spoke under his breath in a rapid murmur, the magic settling around the contained diadem like a structure being reinforced before demolition. "Ready?" Harry asked. Snape looked at the diadem through the containment field. His face was doing something that Harry couldn't quite read, complicated and interior and not for Harry to interpret. "Yes," Snape said. Harry had thought about who should do this one. He could do it himself, had done 2 of the others. But the diadem was Ravenclaw's, and it had been hidden in this school, and Snape had taught in this school for 17 years alongside the thing without knowing what it was. Harry had decided, for reasons that were partly practical and partly something he'd stopped trying to over-rationalize since the charms came off, that Snape should have this one. "Would you?" Harry said. Snape looked at him. "It should be you," Harry said simply. Something moved through Snape's expression. He turned to the containment field, reached through Marchbanks's protocol with the precision of someone who'd been told exactly how by the healer beforehand, and pressed the basilisk fong through the diadem's crown. The scream was worse than the cups. The diadem was older, the anchor deeper, and the room of requirement shuddered in a way that sent Hermione into Ron's shoulder and made the ceiling groan and scatter dust. Then it stopped, and the darkness that moved out of the destroyed object was the particular density of something that had been sitting in a school for children for 50 years, invisible and malevolent, and it dispersed into the air of the castle and was gone. For down. Nagini was February. Harry had been working on this one with Marchbanks and a magizoologist from the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures whose specific expertise was serpent behavior and who had been deeply interested in the project and deeply careful about not asking questions whose answers he suspected he'd find uncomfortable. The mechanism was straightforward in principle and required extensive precision in execution. Harry would speak to Nagini in Parseltongue, issuing a command series that exploited the specific authority a Parselmouth carried over magical serpents, commanding her to stillness. The venom-tipped bolt from a specially prepared crossbow, Sirius's suggestion, and a good one, since it allowed distance between Harry and the snake while delivering the venom contact that would destroy the anchored fragment, would do the rest. They didn't know where Nagini was. In Albania, somewhere, with Voldemort's rudimentary form. But Crouch Jr. had confirmed a specific detail in his Veritaserum interview. Voldemort communicated with certain loyal Death Eaters through a dream connection using Nagini as a conduit. The Auror surveillance team tracking known Death Eater safe houses had been watching for the specific magical signature of that conduit for 2 months. They found it in late January. A property in Wiltshire. Pettigrew, Peter Pettigrew, who had faked his death and been Scabbers for 12 years, and whose capture now was its own entirely satisfying chapter that Harry filed as one of the genuinely good things that had happened in the chaos of the last few months, mostly because watching Sirius's expression when they brought Pettigrew in was something Harry would remember for a long time. The operation was Bones's, with Harry and Sirius as formal participants under the emergency wartime provisions she'd invoked using Crouch Jr.'s testimony as the legal foundation. Harry didn't lead the Auror team, Proudfoot led it, because leading Auror teams was Proudfoot's job and she was very good at it. But he was there, because Parseltongue was required, and because there was no version of this operation where Sirius was going without him. They went in at 3 in the morning. The property was a derelict farmhouse, the magical concealment half degraded in a way that spoke of reduced capacity on the occupant's part. Pettigrew was there, thin and frightened and performing loyal servitude with the specific quality of someone for whom loyal servitude was a survival mechanism rather than a conviction. Nagini was there, vast and aware, coiled near a fire that had been constructed around a cauldron that Harry recognized, even from a doorway across the room, as the beginning stages of a regeneration ritual. Harry walked forward without waiting for the all-clear from Proudfoot, because the timing was precise and the all-clear wasn't relevant, and he walked to within 15 feet of the snake and spoke. Parseltongue sounded like itself, the hissing, liquid quality that other people found alarming and which Harry had always found oddly comfortable, and he spoke the command series he'd practiced, and Nagini's head swung toward him with the specific attention of a creature recognizing authority in its own register. The stillness took 3 seconds to settle. It was enough. The bolt went true. Sirius had built it by hand, which was excessive and probably unnecessary and also exactly the right thing for Sirius to have done with his hands for the month of January. The basilisk venom hit and Nagini made a sound that was not a scream. Snakes didn't scream, but was something in that register, a subsonic exhalation of something that had been living inside her for decades, and then she was still in a different way, in the way that things were still when they were only themselves again. 5 down. 1 to go. Pettigrew tried to run and Proudfoot had him before he made the door, and the expression on his face when he looked at Sirius over the Auror's arm was the expression of a man who had spent 12 years betting on the wrong outcome and was now experiencing the specific consequences of that bet. "Hello, Peter," Sirius said pleasantly. "You look terrible." The rudimentary body in the cauldron was destroyed by Bones's team using a combination of fire and targeted ward breaking that Harry watched from across the room. It didn't scream. It didn't do much of anything, it was incomplete, barely sustained, and its destruction produced nothing more dramatic than a brief flare of sickly light that left a smell of sulfur. Voldemort was not dead. His soul existed. It was scattered and unanchored and diminished to a fragment of what it had been, but it existed, somewhere, in the way that things without a body and without a purpose still managed to exist. Which was fine. Because they knew where it was going. The Horcrux removal from Harry's scar was scheduled for early March. Marchbanks had the procedure fully prepared, the St. Mungo's soul magic team coordinated, the soul fragment confirmed as inert following Nagini's destruction and the tether's collapse. Harry had felt that, the tether going. He'd been expecting it based on the 1731 treatise and it had come anyway as a surprise, because the intellectual expectation of something and the physical experience of it were different. He'd been in the library when it happened, a specific March afternoon, sunlight through the window, Hermione across the table with her own reading, and it had felt like a door closing somewhere very deep, the quiet click of something that had always been slightly ajar finally becoming fully, cleanly shut. His scar stopped hurting. Not a gradual fade, a full stop, immediate and permanent, as though it had forgotten what pain was. He'd sat very still for a moment. "Harry?" Hermione said, looking up. "The tether's gone," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand briefly on his, and he covered it with his and they sat like that for a moment while the sunlight moved across the library floor and everything that had just changed continued changing. The procedure itself was an hour, under general sedation at St. Mungo's, Sirius in the waiting room doing something between pacing and controlled sitting that Remus, who had come, who was there, who was the kind of steady constant presence that Harry was only now properly appreciating, managed by handing him tea at regular intervals with the focused patience of someone who understood that giving Sirius Black something to hold was functionally equivalent to giving a less articulate person something to worry. Harry woke up clear. He'd been clear since October. But this was a different clarity, the last residue gone, the scar on his forehead a scar and nothing else, just healed skin and a lightning-shaped memory with no active component, no darkness underneath, no thread connecting him to anything. "How do you feel?" Marchbanks asked. "Like myself," Harry said. "Completely." She smiled, which was only the second time he'd seen her do it. The trial was set for the 1st of June. In the 4 months between the Horcrux work and the trial, Things had moved with the momentum of a structure that had been set in motion and was now simply following its own logic. Bones's investigation had produced a formal evidence file of 312 pages. The Wisengamot sessions had proceeded with the incremental, grinding quality of institutional change, slower than Harry would have liked, faster than Dumbledore had anticipated. The block had shifted 3 more times, each shift representing a person who had reached the limit of what they could rationalize and had quietly moved to the uncommitted column or, in 2 cases, to active support. Dumbledore had fought for every inch. Harry had expected nothing less. The man's intelligence was genuine, his political skills were real, and his conviction that he was right, that the greater good demanded certain things that smaller minds weren't equipped to understand, was unshakable. He made his case at every session with the eloquence of a man who had been making his case since before most of his listeners were born, and he was persuasive, and it cost Harry real effort to counteract him through the available channels rather than through shortcuts. He didn't take shortcuts. Because he'd meant what he said to Hermione in the safe house, months ago, the answer to institutional corruption was the institution held to its own standards. Anything else would just be a different kind of power doing a different kind of harm. Ron said, around February, that Harry had become suspiciously good at patience, and Harry had said that was probably what happened when the thing artificially preventing your strategic thinking was removed, and Ron had said that was less reassuring than it sounded, and Harry had laughed, which was something he was doing more of. He was doing a lot of things more. Eating properly. Sleeping with the full depth that people slept when they weren't carrying a parasitic fragment of another person's soul behind their eyes. Flying, just flying, sometimes, over the lake in the early morning when the mist was on the water and the firebolt was everything it had always been, and without anxiety or guilt or the reflexive sense that enjoyment was something he hadn't earned. He was finding that he liked the sunrise from 500 feet with the wind and nothing else requiring his attention, and that this was fine, and that the liking of it didn't cost him anything. He wrote to the Dursleys. Not a warm letter. Not a forgiving one. That was a longer process and he was not going to perform it before he felt it. But a clear, adult letter that laid out the situation plainly, informed them of the changes in his legal standing, and made clear that the arrangement he'd lived under for 10 years was not going to continue indefinitely. He got no reply and had not expected one, and filed the whole thing under things requiring longer-term attention and moved on. He wrote to Andromeda Tonks, Sirius's cousin, who was technically a Potter family contact through a network of old connections that Harry was still mapping. Her daughter Nymphadora was an Auror in training under Bones's department and had been tangentially involved in several operations over the winter. Harry wrote a careful letter and received, by return owl, a response that was warm and sharp and invited him to Sunday lunch with a directness that was characteristic of the Black family even in its less catastrophic members. He went. He liked them enormously. The 1st of June arrived clear and warm, the kind of June morning that London produced occasionally and that made all its other mornings feel worth waiting for. The Wisengamot chamber was full, every seat, the gallery above at capacity, reporters from the Prophet and the Quibbler and 2 European wizarding publications positioned in the designated press area with their quick quotes quills and their barely contained energy. Harry arrived with Sirius and Bones. He wore the Potter family robes. He'd worn them to every Wisengamot session, because the principle was the same each time, and he took his seat and looked around the room with the specific quality of attention he'd developed over the past 8 months, which was the attention of someone who knew what rooms were for and how they worked. Dumbledore was already seated. Not in the Chief Warlock's position, that had remained suspended since November, Ogden presiding with the focused calm of someone who had been waiting for this particular responsibility for 20 years. Dumbledore sat in the floor-level member position he'd occupied since the first motion carried, dressed formally, composed, carrying himself with the dignity of a man who was not going to be seen to flinch. The trial began. Bones presented the full evidentiary file. 312 pages, read into the formal record by a clerk in measured portions, with specific items highlighted for the body's attention. The diagnostic findings. The Crouch Jr. testimony, establishing that Dumbledore had known about the plot to restore Voldemort and had chosen to manage his response to it rather than disclose it to the appropriate authorities. The records of decisions made regarding Harry's placement with the Dursleys, the systematic withholding of information about his legal standing, the nature of the prophecy and Dumbledore's interpretation of it and his consequent planning. This last item produced the deepest silence of the morning. Bones read it plainly, that Albus Dumbledore had known, since approximately 1982, that a fragment of Voldemort's soul resided in Harry Potter's scar, and had made no attempt to seek a medical or magical solution to this, and had instead developed a plan in which Harry would be guided toward a confrontation in which his death would be the operative mechanism for destroying the fragment, and had begun constructing the behavioral and psychological architecture to support this outcome. The chamber was perfectly silent. The subject, Bones said, setting down the document, was 14 years old when this investigation began. She sat down. Ogden opened the floor to Dumbledore's response, as protocol required. Dumbledore rose. He stood at the advocate's position for a moment without speaking, which was itself unusual. Dumbledore was a man who was always ready with words. He looked around the chamber with an expression that Harry watched carefully and found, for the first time in 8 months of watching Dumbledore's expressions, genuinely unguarded. "I have made mistakes," Dumbledore said. The chamber absorbed this. "I have made them in the particular way that intelligent people make mistakes, with comprehensive reasoning, thoroughly examined justifications, and the certainty that came from knowing more than almost anyone else and trusting that knowledge too completely." He paused. "I believed that I could see the shape of the conflict we were in, and that the shape required certain things. I believed that certain costs were acceptable. I managed them as a general manages resources, with the cold clarity that I told myself was wisdom." He stopped again. "The thing I did not account for sufficiently was the alternative. The possibility that the problem I had defined as requiring a specific sacrifice might admit of another solution, if the person at the center of it had been given the capacity to look for one." He looked at Harry across the chamber. "I was wrong about what was necessary," he said. "And I was wrong to take from Harry the tools that might have shown me sooner that I was wrong." The chamber was very still. Harry held Dumbledore's gaze. He didn't look away and he didn't perform a reaction, not forgiveness, not coldness, not the dramatic confrontation that the room might have expected. He just looked at the old man who had built him and been wrong about what he was building, and felt something that was honest and complicated and that he was going to need time to understand properly. Dumbledore sat down. The vote took 40 minutes to prepare, because there were multiple motions to consider: formal censure, removal from the chief warlock position permanently rather than as a suspension, the question of criminal charges under the 1947 Act, and the separate question of his continued position as Hogwarts headmaster. Harry voted for all of them. His 2 seats, both votes, for every motion. The censure passed 41-9. The permanent removal from Chief Warlock passed 38-12. The criminal charge referral, a formal recommendation to prosecute under the 1947 Act, passed 31-19, which was the tightest of the votes and the one that had required the most work over the past months to make viable. The Hogwarts headmastership was, legally, a Board of Governors decision rather than a Wisengamot one, and Bones noted this formally for the record and indicated that the board would be receiving the full evidentiary file with a formal request for review. Dumbledore did not leave the chamber immediately. He sat while the votes were counted and the results announced, and then he stood and gathered his robes and walked toward the exit with the same dignity he'd walked in with, and as he passed Harry's chair he stopped. Harry looked up at him. "The solution you found," Dumbledore said quietly, not for the room but for Harry directly. "The tether collapse. The medical procedure. I had read the 1731 treatise." He paused. "I did not look at the footnote." "I know," Harry said. Dumbledore nodded once, slowly. "For what it is worth, Harry, I know," Harry said again. Not unkindly. Not warmly. Just clearly. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment longer. Then he walked out of the chamber, and the doors closed behind him, and the room let out a breath it had been holding. June 24th was the third task. Harry participated. He'd considered refusing, he was legally bound by the goblet, and Bones's team had looked at the binding and determined that the specific conditions of the original contract, predicated as they were on an illegally imperioused goblet, might be challengeable, but the challenge would take longer than the 6 days between the trial and the task, and Harry had decided after a day of consideration that refusing wasn't what he wanted to do anyway. He wanted to finish it. Not because he felt he had to. Not because he was afraid. Because the tournament was there, and the maze was there, and the portkey at the center was known and secured. Bones's team had been to the Little Hangleton graveyard in April and had set ward work that would make any ritual attempted there about as effective as performing surgery in a hurricane, and Harry thought that completing the task on his own terms, in his own way, was simply the right ending to the story the tournament thought it was telling. He went into the maze at the same time as the other champions. He moved through it with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent the last 8 months thinking clearly about every problem he encountered, taking the obstacles as they came. A blast-ended script he banished with a reductor curse without breaking stride, a sphinx whose riddle he answered in 15 seconds while the sphinx itself looked faintly put out, a Dementor impersonator that he patronized into next week. He reached the Triwizard Cup at the center of the maze. He stood in front of it and looked at it. The portkey enchantment was visible to him now. He could read it, with his full magical perception unblocked, as a layer of enchantment over the object's natural magic, crude and deliberately designed. The graveyard coordinates were there, plainly visible if you knew what you were looking at. He cast a charm that Hermione had found and that he'd practiced for 2 weeks, a portkey redirection, applied to the landing coordinates, and watched the enchantment reconfigure around the new destination. Then he picked up the cup. The portkey activated. He landed, not in a graveyard, but in the DMLE's secure transport arrival point at the Ministry, where Bones and 3 Aurors were waiting with the specific preparedness of people who had been told to expect this and were still slightly surprised it had worked. "Well," Bones said. "Cup secured," Harry said. "You'll want to have someone pull Cedric out of the maze, he was about 20 feet behind me." He looked down at the cup in his hand. "Can I give this to Bones's evidence department or does the tournament committee need it back?" There was a pause while Bones visibly did not smile. "The evidence department will take it," she said. Later, when the tournament committee had been dealt with and Cedric had been found, fine, mildly disgruntled, and extremely curious, and the press had produced the specific chaos that was inevitable given a Triwizard champion appearing in the Ministry rather than a graveyard, Harry was in Sirius's sitting room at Grimmauld Place, which had been extensively de-Slytherined and currently looked like somewhere a person might actually want to live, with Sirius and Remus and Ron and Hermione, eating takeaway that someone had had the excellent judgment to order. Remus was telling a story about James and a transfiguration practical exam that Harry was listening to with the specific quality of attention he gave to stories about his parents now, fully present, every detail welcome, the grief exactly the weight it should be and no heavier. Ron had his feet on the coffee table, which Sirius had given him express permission to do after Hermione objected, and he was working through the takeaway with the focus of someone who had burned considerable calories worrying over the past 8 months and was now in the process of recovery. Hermione was reading. She was always reading. In the chaos of everything she was somehow simultaneously always reading. Harry sat with his back against the couch, legs stretched toward the fire, and ate his food and listened to Remus's story and felt the particular quality of a room where people were doing ordinary things without fear, which was different from a room where people were doing ordinary things while managing fear, and which he was finding he quite liked. "So Voldemort," Ron said, in the middle of Remus's story. Everyone looked at him. "At some point," Ron said, because he'd always been direct in proportion to how serious something was, "he's going to get a body again. He's going to find a way. He's been doing this for 50 years and losing his Horcruxes doesn't mean he stops." He looked at Harry. The thing in the graveyard was sorted. "But the larger, I know," Harry said. "Do you have a plan?" Harry thought about the prophecy. Neither can live while the other survives. He thought about immortal Voldemort, no anchors, no fragments, no distributed soul architecture, who would eventually find a way to a body and would, when he did, be an enormously powerful dark wizard with decades of experience and a coherent magical theory and an army of followers, but nothing between him and death except the same things that stood between anyone and death. He thought about himself, unthrottled, uncharmed, fully operational, with 8 months of strategic and political and magical experience that had been compressed into the kind of growth that normally took decades, with allies who were real and chosen and formidable, and a power rating that St. Mungo's had confirmed and then confirmed again and then written a paper about. Yes, Harry said. But it can wait until after dessert. Ron looked at Hermione. Hermione looked at Ron. Sirius reached over to the takeaway bag and produced a box of something that smelled excellent. Fair enough, Ron said. Remus finished his story. James Potter had managed to transfigure the exam table into a passable impersonation of Professor Dumbledore, which had gotten him a detention and, privately, Remus suspected, a very small smile from McGonagall that she'd turned away too quickly to be caught. Harry laughed. It came out real and full and entirely unmanaged, and it was so straightforwardly itself that Ron looked at him with a grin and said, "There it is. That's you, that is." "What?" "You've been you all year," Ron said, "but that laugh's the last bit. That's the last piece." He shrugged, the way Ron shrugged when he'd said something true and had no interest in overdressing it. Just, there it is. Harry looked at his friends. At Sirius, who had come back from 12 years of Azkaban and found something to come back for. At Remus, steady and warm and present. At Hermione, who had put down the book at some point in the last 10 minutes and was just here, in the room, with the rest of them. At Ron, who was Ron, which had always been the best thing Ron was. He thought about a boy who had spent 14 years being managed and suppressed and shaped into a sacrifice, and who had sat in a hospital wing while a fierce small woman named Pomfrey had said "I found something" and had not looked away from what she'd found. He thought about what it meant to be entirely, accountably, irrefutably himself. Outside the window of Grimmauld Place, London was doing what it did, loud and careless and enormous, traffic and voices and the midsummer blue of a sky that had no interest in anyone's emotional journey. The fire in the grate said ordinary things. The food was good. The room had the specific warmth of people who were choosing to be in it. Harry Potter, lord of the most ancient and noble house of Potter, unchained and uncharmed and 14 years old and entirely done being a pawn, finished his takeaway. "Right," he said. "Dessert first. Then the plan." Sirius opened the box.